Come close now, dear soul, you who have wandered far through another day that asked more of your heart than seemed possible to give. You who have carried burdens that were never meant to be borne by human shoulders alone. You whose spirit has been tested by hours filled with demands and disappointments that seem to multiply faster than solutions can be found. I see you there in whatever quiet corner of the world has become your refuge this evening, perhaps feeling the accumulated weight of responsibilities that press down like stones upon your chest, perhaps wondering if there truly exists anywhere in this vast universe a place where rest is more than just a distant promise, whispered by voices too faint to trust completely. Welcome, my cherished companion, to this sacred haven we are creating together. This gentle harbor where the relentless storms of daily existence cannot reach your weary heart, where peace settles around your tired shoulders, like the warmest blanket woven from moonlight, and divine compassion that knows your name and understands every struggle you have faced today. You have traveled so far to reach this moment of stillness, navigating through countless obstacles that would have defeated lesser spirits, dodging the sharp edges of words spoken carelessly by those who do not understand the extraordinary tenderness of your heart that feels everything so deeply, it sometimes threatens to break under the sheer weight of caring for a world that often seems indifferent to suffering. Your compassion has cost you greatly today, as it always does, leaving you feeling simultaneously empty and strangely full, exhausted yet somehow energized by the mysterious knowledge that love has flowed through you into spaces where darkness had taken up residence and convinced weary hearts they would never again experience the warmth of genuine human connection or divine grace that transforms ordinary moments into encounters with the sacred that lingers long after the immediate circumstances have changed or passed away entirely. Take this precious moment now to simply become aware of where you find yourself, to feel the blessed relief of setting down that invisible pack you have been carrying throughout these long hours, allowing your body to remember what it truly means to be supported completely without having to earn that support through effort or achievement or any form of striving that has become so deeply ingrained in your daily existence, you barely recognize how thoroughly it exhausts every muscle and bone and nerve ending that was created for rest rather than endless performance and service to expectations that multiply like weeds in untended gardens. The surface that holds you now, whether it be the familiar comfort of your own bed where you have wrestled with sleepless nights before this one, or perhaps a chair that has become your evening sanctuary where you retreat when the noise and chaos of the outside world grow too overwhelming for your sensitive soul to process without some form of protective barrier between yourself and the endless stream of demands for your attention and energy. Receives your weary form with the kind of unconditional acceptance that your spirit has been craving all day long, offering the gentle embrace that asks nothing and gives everything, that requires no performance and provides infinite comfort to hearts that have forgotten what it feels like to be held without conditions or expectations attached to such tenderness. Let us breathe together now, you and I, sharing these moments of conscious connection with the miraculous gift of life itself that flows through your lungs without your permission or active participation. This extraordinary process that has sustained you through every trial of this day and will continue sustaining you through whatever challenges tomorrow may bring to your doorstep like unwelcome visitors who demand hospitality you feel too exhausted to provide. Draw in slowly and deeply through your nose, feeling your chest expand not merely with oxygen, but with possibility itself, with hope that refuses to be extinguished, no matter how many times circumstances have seemed to blow against the flickering flame of your faith, with the whispered promise that rest is not only possible, but is your divine birthright as a beloved child of the one who created you for joy rather than endless struggle. Hold this breath gently for just a moment, not with the tension that has characterized so much of your day, but with the tender care you might use to cradle a sleeping infant whose peaceful expression reminds you that there still exists in this world something pure and untainted by the harsh realities that adults must navigate with whatever wisdom and strength they can summon from reserves that sometimes seem dangerously close to empty. Recognize that the air filling your lungs carries more than the scientific elements necessary for physical survival. Carries healing properties that science has not yet learned to measure. Carries hope that transcends rational explanation. Carries the very breath of divine love that spoke the universe into existence and continues, speaking your name with infinite tenderness every moment of every day, whether you are consciously aware of this reality or not. Feel how your ribs expand outward like doors opening to welcome long-awaited guests who bring news of peace and restoration. How your diaphragm descends like a blessing, settling into the deepest places of your being where wounds have been hidden from public view, but never from the loving eyes of the one who sees all and judges with mercy rather than condemnation. Who understands the source of every scar and the reason behind every defensive wall you have built to protect the precious vulnerability at the core of your authentic self. Even this simple act of breathing becomes a form of prayer when offered with conscious gratitude to the inexhaustible source from which all breath comes, and to which all breath returns in the eternal rhythm of giving and receiving that governs all existence at levels both visible and invisible to human perception. Now release this breath slowly through slightly parted lips, breathing out not merely carbon dioxide, but every accumulated frustration of the hours just past, every disappointment that has clung to your spirit like dust on a traveler's cloak after a long journey through difficult terrain, every moment of confusion or fear or anger or sadness that found its way into the sacred chambers of your heart and attempted to set up permanent residence there, as if it had some legitimate right to occupy. Space that was specifically created for joy and peace and love so pure, it would overwhelm you with its beauty if you could perceive it directly with your physical senses. Let all of these burdens flow out of you now on this gentle exhalation like muddy water flowing downstream toward the ocean where it will be purified and made clean again, carrying away the debris of difficult hours and leaving behind only the clear, authentic essence of who you truly are beneath all the roles you must play and all the masks you wear to navigate a world that often seems too harsh for hearts as tender and genuine as yours has always been. Again now, breathing in peace that surpasses human understanding, breathing in the deep assurance that this moment belongs entirely to you and to the love that has been pursuing you relentlessly through every maze of worry and anxiety, following you through every labyrinth of confusion and doubt, waiting with infinite patience for you to pause long enough in your hurried journey to recognize the constant presence that never leaves and never forsakes, that knows not only your name, but also your deepest pain and your most secret longings with an intimacy that would terrify you if it were not wrapped in such complete compassion and acceptance. Your lungs are filling now, not just with air, but with recognition that you are being held by arms that never grow tired of carrying you, supported by love that never questions whether you deserve such devoted attention, surrounded by grace that sees not what you have accomplished or failed to accomplish, but who you are becoming through every struggle and every surrender, every mistake and every moment of beautiful courage that has brought you one step closer to this place of rest. Hold it tenderly, this precious gift of breath that comes without cost or condition, and feel how it connects you to every living creature that shares this planet with you, every tree that exhales the oxygen you inhale in perfect symbiotic harmony, every person whose lungs fill and empty in the same ancient rhythm that has sustained life since the very first breath was drawn in the garden where all stories began, and toward which all stories ultimately return when temporary separations are healed. and scattered children finally find their way back home to the arms that have been waiting patiently for their return. You are part of something vast and beautiful and eternal, something that existed before time began its measured march, through seasons and years, and will continue long after time has served its purpose and been folded up like a garment that is no longer needed because winter has finally given way to eternal spring, where tears become laughter and every sorrow is transformed into joy deeper than human language can adequately express or contain within mere words. Now breathe out once more, releasing not only the used air that has served its purpose, but every weight you have been carrying that was never meant to be yours alone. Every burden you picked up along the way because someone dropped it, and your compassionate heart could not bear to see it lying there, unclaimed and unattended. Every responsibility that attached itself to your willing spirit, like a lost child seeking comfort from the first adult who showed genuine care and concern for its welfare. Release every expectation that others have placed upon your shoulders, because they recognized in you the kind of strength that comes not from hardness or indifference, but from resilience rooted in love. The kind of courage that appears not because it knows no fear, but because it chooses love over fear again and again, until choosing love becomes as natural as breathing, as automatic as the beating of your faithful heart, as constant as the turning of the earth that carries you safely through each day, and each night toward a destiny more beautiful than your most wonderful dreams have ever dared to imagine. Feel now how your breathing has begun to slow and deepen without any conscious effort on your part, finding its own perfect rhythm like ocean waves discovering their eternal dance with shores that have welcomed them for countless millennia, like your heart settling into the steady beat of someone who knows beyond all doubt that they are completely safe, completely loved, completely accepted exactly as they are in this moment, without needing to change anything about themselves to earn or deserve or prove their worthiness to receive the comfort that is being offered as freely as sunlight, as generously as morning rain on thirsty ground, as constantly as the gravitational force that holds every atom in the universe in perfect harmony and calls it all very good. You are not alone in this peaceful gathering tonight, my dearest friend and fellow traveler on the long road that leads from earth to heaven. All across our sleeping world, other souls exactly like yours have found their way to this same sanctuary of rest, other weary hearts seeking the same comfort you are discovering in these quiet moments, other searching spirits who understand from personal experience what it means to feel overwhelmed by the sheer complexity of existence in an age that seems specifically designed to fragment attention and fracture the peace that human souls require to flourish, rather than merely survive from one challenging day to another, hoping that tomorrow might bring the fulfillment that today promised, but somehow failed to deliver despite the best intentions and most sincere efforts. Some who join us in this contemplative space tonight have been walking the pathways of faith for many decades, their hearts seasoned by years of learning to distinguish between the voice of authentic divine love and the countless other voices that compete for human attention in a world filled with distractions and false promises, their spirits strengthened by countless encounters with grace that has proven itself faithful through seasons of abundance, when gratitude came easily, and seasons of scarcity when trust required supernatural courage to maintain in the face of circumstances that seemed to contradict everything they had been taught to believe about divine goodness and care for human welfare. Others may be newer to this kind of spiritual exploration, their hearts cautiously opening to possibilities they may have dismissed in earlier chapters of their lives when cynicism seemed like wisdom and skepticism felt like necessary protection against disappointment that comes when souls dare to hope for something better than what their experience has taught them to expect from a world that often breaks more promises than it keeps. They have been drawn by longings they can barely name but cannot ignore, pulled by hunger that has grown stronger with each passing year that has taught them. Earthly pleasures alone cannot satisfy the God-shaped emptiness within every human heart. The sacred hollow that can only be filled by connection with the source from which all souls come, and to which all souls are ultimately destined to return like rivers, flowing inevitably toward the sea that birthed them in the beginning of all beginnings. Whether you arrive here tonight as a seasoned pilgrim whose feet are intimately familiar with these ancient pathways of contemplation, or as a curious newcomer, taking tentative first steps into territories that feel both foreign and mysteriously familiar, like landscapes glimpsed in dreams that seem more real than waking life, you are equally welcome in this community of hearts that have learned to recognize their profound need for something beyond what the visible world can provide. Something deeper than temporary pleasure or fleeting success. Something truer than the shifting sands of human opinion and cultural fashion that change with each passing decade but leave souls still searching for solid ground on which to build lives of genuine meaning and enduring purpose and unshakable joy that does not depend on circumstances being favorable or people being kind or plans working out according to human expectations. The very fact that you have chosen to spend these precious evening hours in contemplation of eternal things, rather than consuming entertainment that demands nothing of your heart or mind and returns nothing to your soul, speaks to something beautiful awakening within you, some deep recognition that your spirit was made for communion with love itself rather than settling for cheap substitutes that promise satisfaction but deliver only temporary distraction from the longings that return with renewed intensity once the distraction ends. You are discovering that some hungers can only be satisfied by bread that does not perish. Some thirsts can only be quenched by water that springs up into eternal life. Some loneliness can only be healed by connection with the One who created you for relationship and will never stop pursuing your heart until you find your rest in the love that first imagined you before the foundation of the world was laid. Tonight we are about to embark together on an extraordinary journey that will transport us across continents and centuries to walk alongside the most remarkable person who has ever drawn breath upon this earth, to witness love in its absolute purest form as it moved through our world clothed in human flesh yet retaining its divine nature, touching lives and transforming hearts in ways that continue to ripple through time like stones dropped into still water that create circles, spreading far beyond the point where they first disturbed the surface. We will not observe these sacred events from the safe distance of academic study or historical curiosity, but we will experience them as beloved friends invited into the inner circle of divine love, allowing our hearts to be opened by the same grace that opened the hearts of fishermen and tax collectors, of prostitutes and religious leaders, of anyone whose life intersected with this extraordinary man whose presence changed everything it touched and whose influence continues changing everything it touches even now, even here, even in this very moment as we prepare to meet him together. Feel yourself beginning to release your grip on the familiar landmarks of your contemporary world, the digital devices that keep you connected to endless streams of information and obligation, the artificial lighting that banishes natural darkness and the peaceful rhythms it was designed to bring to human hearts that were created to live by ancient patterns rather than the relentless schedules that govern modern existence. The constant hum of machinery that has become the soundtrack to 21st century life is fading now, becoming distant and unimportant as we prepare to step backward through the corridors of time into an era when people measured their days by the sun's journey across the sky rather than the frantic ticking of clocks that slice existence into manageable but ultimately meaningless segments. Chapter 2. Journey into Sacred Lands. The transformation begins as naturally as dawn breaking over hills that have witnessed countless sunrises, as gently as flowers opening their petals to receive the first light of morning that has traveled across impossible distances through space to kiss their faces with warmth that speaks of love beyond human comprehension. Feel the ground beneath your feet changing from the processed surfaces of contemporary life that separate you from the earth itself to natural textures that connect you directly with soil and stone that have supported human steps for generations beyond counting. Paths worn smooth by countless pilgrims who walked these same routes carrying prayers in their hearts and hope in their steps. Merchants whose caravans moved slowly but steadily between distant cities. Shepherds whose patient care for their woolly charges taught them lessons about divine love that no classroom could ever provide. This is Palestine as it existed 2,000 years ago, my beloved traveling companion. A narrow strip of land that served as a bridge between great civilizations where cultures met and mingled, where the ancient and eternal intersected with the temporal and immediate in ways that created the perfect stage for the greatest drama ever enacted upon the theater of human history. The air you are breathing now carries scents that have been lost to most modern experience. The clean sweetness of wild honey mixed with the earthy richness of bread baked in outdoor ovens by women whose hands have learned the sacred art of transforming simple grain into sustenance that nourishes more than bodies, whose hearts understand intuitively that feeding others is one of the purest expressions of love that human beings can offer to one another in a world where hunger takes many forms. The sky above you stretches in a dome of blue so perfect and unblemished, it seems to have been painted by divine fingers that took infinite care to create exactly the right backdrop for the story about to unfold beneath its vast and welcoming expanse. Clouds drift across this celestial canvas like thoughts moving slowly across the mind of the Almighty, some heavy with rain that will water the crops growing in terraced fields, carved into hillsides by farmers who understand their work as partnership with heaven, cooperation with forces beyond their control that provide sunshine and seasons according to wisdom they have learned to trust, even when they cannot fully comprehend the intricacies of divine timing and providential care that governs all growing things. The sun moves across this ancient sky, not as the distant nuclear furnace described by modern science, but as the very lamp of the Most High, providing light and warmth that speak of personal care so intimate, it notices every sparrow that falls to earth and numbers every hair on every human head, illuminating this sacred landscape with golden radiance that transforms ordinary moments into glimpses of glory that would blind us with their beauty if we could perceive them with the eyes of eternity rather than the limited vision of temporal existence that sees only fragments of divine purpose working itself out through circumstances that often appear random or meaningless to understanding, clouded by the fog of immediate concerns and temporary difficulties. Rolling hills covered with olive groves stretch toward horizons painted in colors that no earthly artist has ever managed to capture, completely despite countless attempts to reproduce on canvas what can only be truly appreciated by hearts that have learned to see beauty as revelation rather than mere aesthetic pleasure. These ancient trees with their twisted trunks speak of patience and endurance that span centuries, their silver-green leaves catching light in ways that transform ordinary breezes into visible manifestations of invisible grace. Their precious fruit destined to be pressed into oil that will illuminate homes and anoint heads and carry prayers upward on smoke that rises from altars where gratitude finds expression in forms as old as human memory and as fresh as each new dawn that brings mercies that are new every morning, because divine faithfulness never fails those who put their trust in love that never changes. Scattered across these ancient hills like pearls dropped from heaven's jewelry box are villages, built from stones that came from the very ground on which they stand. Communities that seem to grow naturally from the landscape rather than imposing themselves upon it like conquering armies. claiming territory through force and intimidation. The houses are simple in design but solid in construction, created by people who understood that the true purpose of shelter is to protect what matters most: the human hearts that gather around cooking. Fires to share stories that connect children to their heritage and bind families together across generations with invisible threads stronger than chains, forged from iron. More enduring than monuments carved from marble by hands seeking to be remembered long after their owners have returned to dust. Windows are small but welcoming, designed to frame views of natural beauty rather than to display accumulated wealth, to invite the gentle light of morning while preserving the intimate privacy of evening conversations, to serve practical needs while honoring aesthetic sensibilities that recognize beauty as necessary for human flourishing as food or water or the air we breathe without conscious thought. Doors are generous in their proportions, built to accommodate not merely the passage of human bodies, but the flow of hospitality that characterizes communities where neighbors are considered family and strangers are welcomed as guests, sent by Providence to test the sincerity of love that is proclaimed in prayers, but proven through practical service to anyone whose need provides opportunity for grace to be demonstrated through human hands and compassionate hearts. The flat rooftops serve as gathering places where families come as evening settles over the land to catch cooling breezes and watch the sun paint the western sky in shades of rose and gold and purple that speak of divine artistry too magnificent for human duplication, too beautiful for words to capture adequately, too perfect for anything but silent wonder that opens hearts to worship as natural as breathing, as spontaneous as laughter, as inevitable as tears of joy that flow when souls recognize beauty too pure for fallen worlds to contain, yet too generous to be withheld from hearts that have learned to receive gifts they did not earn and could never deserve. The air carries fragrances that modern noses have never experienced, but ancient hearts remember as the very scent of home, of belonging, of places where love has made its dwelling, regardless of architectural grandeur or material wealth accumulated through years of labor and careful management of resources. Wild thyme and rosemary grow along forgotten pathways where children gather herbs for mothers, whose cooking transforms simple ingredients into meals that nourish more than physical bodies, that feed souls hungry for the comfort that comes only when food is prepared by hands that understand cooking as sacrament, as offering of love made tangible in forms that can be tasted and shared, and remembered long after stomachs are spied and hearts are warmed by more than the calories, consumed during fellowship around tables where conversation flows like wine and laughter rises like incense. Mixed with these herbal perfumes is the warmer scent of wool from sheep that graze contentedly on hills carpeted with grass and wildflowers that bloom in season without human cultivation or care. Animals whose simple trust under the watchful eyes of shepherds who know each one by name and would risk everything to rescue even one that wandered away from the safety of the flock, speaks of security that comes not from insurance policies or investment portfolios, but from relationship with those whose love makes protection not merely a duty but a joy, whose care extends beyond mere survival to encompass the well-being of creatures, whose innocent dependence transforms ordinary work into sacred calling, mundane responsibility into opportunity for love to be expressed in forms as practical as they are profound. The subtle fragrance of frankincense and myrrh drifts on evening breezes like prayers made visible, speaking of worship offered with materials that cost their offerers real sacrifice, but were given gladly because true devotion cannot be expressed through gifts that cost nothing and therefore teach the heart nothing about the value of what it claims to treasure above all else. These precious resins, gathered at great expense and considerable danger from distant lands, by merchants who understood that some things cannot be measured in coins alone, find their way into temples and homes where gratitude needs expression in forms more tangible than words alone can provide, where love seeks outlets more costly than mere sentiment, where faith demonstrates itself through offerings that represent not just spiritual devotion, but practical trust in divine provision that never fails those whose hearts have learned to give without calculating return, to love without demanding reciprocation, to worship without expecting immediate reward for their faithfulness. Fresh water moves through this blessed landscape in streams that follow courses carved by divine intention rather than human engineering, pooling in natural basins where sheep can drink and women can draw the precious liquid that sustains all life, creating music as it flows over stones polished smooth by centuries of current that speaks of persistence and patience, of steady progress toward destinations known only to the one who set these waters in motion and guides their journey toward seas that receive all rivers with equal welcome, regardless of their size or source or the length and difficulty of their journey. From mountain springs to ocean depths where individual streams lose their separate identities in the vast unity of waters that cover the earth. The sound of water moving over stone creates melodies that call human hearts to prayer and reflection without conscious decision. Rhythms that match the deeper pulses of creation itself, harmonies that speak of order beneath apparent chaos, of purpose within seeming randomness, of love that flows steadily toward all creation, even when creation turns its back and walks away in rebellion. Even when creation forgets the source of every gift it receives and imagines, itself self-sufficient and independent of the grace that comes fresh every morning like dew that appears without human effort or understanding, yet provides exactly what growing things need to flourish, rather than merely survive another day in soil that would be barren without heaven's constant generosity, expressed through natural processes that scientists can describe, but never fully explain. Listen carefully now as your heart attunes itself to frequencies that modern ears have forgotten how to perceive, and you will begin to hear other sounds that fill this ancient landscape with the music of life lived according to rhythms older than human memory. The gentle lowing of cattle as they are led to water in the evening. Coolness speaks of contentment that comes from lives lived according to natural patterns rather than artificial schedules imposed by human ambition and mechanical convenience. Voices that carry satisfaction earned through simple obedience to instincts, placed within them by the same creative love that shaped human hearts for relationship and communion with their Maker. Children's voices rise and fall in games that require nothing more elaborate than imagination and the simple joy of being alive in a world full of wonders too numerous to count, too beautiful to fully appreciate in a single lifetime, too generous in its gifts to be comprehended except by hearts that have not yet learned to doubt that every good thing comes from above, that every moment of happiness is grace, that every breath drawn and released is participation in a mystery so profound that the wisest philosophers spend their entire lives trying to understand what children know instinctively from the moment they first open eyes that see not just light and shadow, but love made visible in forms. Their innocent hearts recognize immediately as home, as welcome, as the natural environment for souls created in the image of perfect love. The rhythm of daily life in these ancient communities flows according to patterns established long before anyone can remember. Patterns that connect each generation to all who came before and all who will come after in an unbroken chain of human experience that finds its meaning not in individual achievement or personal fulfillment, but in participation in something larger than any single life can contain or any individual understanding can fully grasp. Work begins with sunrise prayers that acknowledge the gift of another day, and concludes with evening thanksgivings that recognize divine faithfulness expressed through countless blessings, both large and small, that faithful hearts notice and celebrate, while unfaithful hearts overlook and take for granted, as if they had some inherent right to expect good things without acknowledging their source in generous love that gives without calculating the worthiness of recipients. Women rise before dawn to draw water from wells that have served their families for generations, carrying heavy jars balanced perfectly on heads that have learned this skill through daily practice that transforms necessity into grace, walking with dignity that comes not from wealth or social position, but from understanding their essential role in maintaining the life of communities that depend on their faithful service. Their conversations around wells become informal centers of communication, where news travels faster than any official messenger could carry it, where wisdom accumulated through years of experience is passed from older women to younger ones, who will someday carry the same precious knowledge forward to daughters not yet born, but already loved with anticipation that spans generations. Men gather in olive groves and fields where their hands perform work that connects them directly to the earth and its seasons, work that requires patience and faith, because results depend on factors beyond human control, where partnership with divine providence becomes daily reality rather than abstract, theological concept discussed in scholarly debates, but never tested through practical experience. Their labor teaches them lessons about trust and dependence that city dwellers often miss despite their greater access to education and sophisticated technologies that promise to make life easier, but somehow never quite deliver the satisfaction they advertise with such confidence and persuasive marketing techniques. Chapter 3. The Man from Nazareth. In the small hillside town of Nazareth, nestled among the rolling green valleys of Galilee like a precious jewel set in a crown of natural splendor that speaks of divine artistry expressed through landscape that needs no human improvement to reveal its inherent beauty, there lived a young man whose very presence seemed to alter the spiritual atmosphere around him in ways that people noticed without being able to explain through any rational analysis or logical reasoning. His name was Jesus, though those who knew him in his youth would have called him by the Hebrew Yeshua. And while his hands bore the honest calluses earned through years of working with wood and stone under the patient guidance of his earthly father, while his face carried the warm bronze of Mediterranean sun that had blessed his outdoor labor, and while his eyes reflected the deep earth tones of the soil that had nourished him from childhood, there was something in his gaze that made even casual observers pause and look again with growing wonder. He possessed a quality that distinguished him from every other young man in their village, though that distinction was subtle enough that only those with spiritual perception could detect it at first glance, and wise enough to recognize that they were in the presence of someone whose inner life contained depths that ordinary human experience could not adequately explain or categorize. According to conventional understanding of what makes one person different from another in ways that matter beyond surface appearances or obvious talents that impress but do not transform, Jesus had grown up walking these same narrow winding streets where children still play games their ancestors played centuries before his birth, learning his first lessons about human nature and divine love from parents whose extraordinary faithfulness had already marked them as different in a community where faithfulness to religious duty was common, but where their particular quality of surrender to divine will that cost them everything they had planned for their lives created ripples of influence that touched every life that came into contact with their humble household, where miracles were welcomed as naturally as sunrise and mysteries were embraced rather than analyzed until their wonder was dissected away. Joseph, the village carpenter whose workshop echoed with the sounds of creation and restoration taking place through skilled hands that understood their craft as partnership with the divine creator who had first shaped wood from living trees and quarried stone from living mountains, had taught his adopted son that broken things could always be mended with sufficient patience and skill applied day after day until what had been merely functional became beautiful. What had been adequate became excellent. What had been ordinary became extraordinary, through the touch of hands that understood their work as worship offered to the one who created both the materials being shaped and the hands that shaped them for purposes that served both practical needs and aesthetic appreciation. In that workshop filled with wood shavings that curled like prayers rising toward heaven, among tools worn smooth by generations of craftsmen who had learned to see their daily labor as sacred calling rather than mere economic necessity, among projects that would serve families for decades to come with sturdy reliability that spoke of integrity built into every joint and carefully fitted corner, Jesus absorbed understanding that would later blossom into parables about building on foundations solid enough to withstand storms that test the quality of everything constructed upon them, about trees being known by the fruit they produce rather than the promises they make about future harvests, about the patience required for any work that truly matters, taking time that seems excessive to hurried hearts, but proves essential for results that endure beyond the lifetimes of those who create them. With love and dedication, Mary, his mother, whose heart had been stretched wide enough to contain mysteries that would have crushed lesser souls under their weight and responsibility, had demonstrated through every word she spoke and every action she took what it meant to trust completely in purposes larger than human understanding, to say yes to divine plans that challenged every conventional expectation about how divine power operates in human affairs, to carry with grace secrets too wonderful to share, yet too powerful to hide completely from those with eyes to see and hearts, prepared to recognize divine work even when it comes clothed in humility rather than majesty, in weakness rather than overwhelming strength that would compel belief through force rather than inviting faith through love. Her quiet strength and unshakable peace, even in circumstances that would have driven ordinary people to distraction or despair, had provided the stable foundation from which her extraordinary son would launch a ministry that would reach every corner of the earth and extend through every generation until time itself gives way to eternity, where all questions find their perfect answers and all longings discover their complete fulfillment in the presence of love itself, where partial understanding gives way to complete knowledge and shadows give way to substance, and hope gives way to reality more wonderful than any earthly heart has ever dared to imagine in its most optimistic moments of dreaming about what might be possible if love truly could conquer all obstacles and overcome all opposition. Even as a boy whose questions during synagogue discussions revealed understanding that amazed learned men accustomed to children, who fidgeted during long readings and longer explanations that often obscured more than they illuminated the simple truths hearts needed most desperately to hear. There had been something that set Jesus apart from his companions in ways that only became clear to those who looked back years later with the gift of hindsight, illuminated by events that would demonstrate conclusively who this carpenter's son really was beneath the humble exterior that concealed glories too bright for human eyes to behold, directly without being overwhelmed by beauty that would stop hearts and steal breath and leave observers unable to speak or move or think of anything except the wonder of finding themselves in the presence of incarnate love walking among mortals in mortal form. Village elders remembered conversations that seemed to carry weight far beyond their simple words, discussions that revealed layers of meaning they had never suspected existed in familiar texts they thought they understood completely after decades of study and meditation and scholarly debate that had produced more heat than light, more confusion than clarity, more questions than answers that satisfied hungry hearts seeking truth that could transform their understanding of what it meant to know God personally rather than merely knowing about God through secondhand reports and academic theories that impressed minds without changing lives or inspiring hope that transcended earthly circumstances. His questions during those early years penetrated to the heart of matters that had puzzled rabbis for generations, cutting through centuries of commentary and debate to expose truths so simple that children could grasp them, yet so profound that scholars would spend lifetimes exploring depths they had glimpsed only in moments of clarity, granted by grace rather than earned through intellectual effort or achieved through academic credentials that impressed human institutions but meant nothing to divine wisdom that delights in revealing itself to humble hearts while hiding from proud minds that think knowledge can be accumulated like wealth or wielded like weapons against those deemed less worthy of enlightenment. When Jesus listened to ancient stories in the synagogue where his ancestors had gathered for centuries to remember their identity as chosen, people called out of darkness into light for purposes that extended far beyond their individual welfare to encompass the healing of nations and the restoration of creation itself to its original harmony with divine intention. His attention was so complete and his insights so penetrating that grown men found themselves seeing familiar narratives with fresh eyes, discovering connections they had never noticed, understanding implications that had remained hidden until illuminated by observations that seemed to come from someone who had been present when these events originally occurred, who knew the characters involved not as historical figures, but as living friends whose struggles and triumphs held personal meaning, rather than serving merely as moral illustrations for contemporary application. The religious authorities of his day, men who had dedicated their entire adult lives to memorizing intricate details of scriptural law and rabbinic commentary that had grown like coral reefs around the original texts, would eventually struggle to categorize this carpenter who spoke with authority they could not match despite their impressive credentials and institutional positions that normally commanded automatic respect from ordinary people who had neither time nor training to master complex theological distinctions that often obscured rather than clarified the simple truths that human hearts needed most desperately to understand and embrace and live by in their daily struggles with temptation and doubt, and the countless ordinary challenges that test faith more severely than dramatic crises that evoke heroic responses and capture public attention. These learned men inhabited a religious world that had become complicated far beyond recognition of its original simplicity, layered with rules and regulations that often seemed designed more to exclude than include, to burden rather than bless, to create hierarchies of worthiness that separated the supposedly righteous from the obviously sinful, rather than revealing the divine love that embraces all humanity without distinction, based on external performance or internal perfection, that no human being has ever achieved through effort alone, no matter how sincere or sustained or sacrificial. That effort might prove to be over lifetimes of trying to earn what can only be received as gift offered freely to anyone willing to accept it with empty hands and grateful hearts that have learned to stop striving and start receiving. Jesus had grown up observing how ordinary people struggled under spiritual weights they were never meant to carry alone, watching how the light gradually faded from eyes that had once sparkled with hope, when souls felt increasingly disconnected from the God they longed to know and serve, but could not seem to please no matter how hard they tried to follow rules that multiplied faster than human ability to remember them all, much less observe them perfectly in the midst of lives filled with practical concerns about earning daily bread and caring for families whose needs never decreased even when resources became scarce and circumstances grew challenging beyond what human strength alone could handle. He witnessed shoulders sagging beneath burdens that religious authorities kept adding rather than lifting according to their original divine purpose of drawing hearts closer to their Creator rather than driving them away through impossible demands that revealed human inadequacy without providing divine remedy, observed spirits withering under judgment that condemned rather than redeemed, that pointed out failures without offering hope for transformation, that demanded perfection while providing no power to achieve it, except through human effort that proved insufficient again and again, until people began to believe that divine love must be reserved for those fortunate enough to be born with naturally righteous inclinations or blessed enough to possess unusual spiritual gifts that made obedience easier for them than for ordinary people struggling with ordinary weaknesses and temptations. Yet there was something in Jesus that remained undimmed by the spiritual darkness he observed around him, a light that seemed to grow brighter rather than dimmer when confronted with human confusion and pain, and the systematic attempts to obscure divine truth beneath human tradition that served institutional interests more than divine purposes or human needs, crying out for compassionate response rather than additional requirements to fulfill or standards to meet or hoops to jump through before they could be deemed worthy of divine attention and blessing. In Joseph's workshop, surrounded by broken furniture waiting to be restored and raw wood waiting to be shaped into useful forms that would serve families for generations to come, he had learned that redemption was always possible, that what seemed ruined beyond repair could be made beautiful again, through the patient application of skill and care and love that refused to give up on anything created by divine hands for divine purposes. No matter how damaged it might appear to eyes that had grown accustomed to discarding rather than restoring what appeared beyond hope of renewal. The political atmosphere of his time was thick with tension and uncertainty that affected every aspect of daily life in ways both obvious and subtle, creating an environment where hope was considered dangerous and trust was rare, because those who dared to believe in better possibilities often found themselves crushed beneath systems designed to maintain control rather than promote human flourishing according to divine intention that sees every person as precious and every life as sacred regardless of social status or economic position or political affiliation or religious performance, that satisfied human observers while potentially missing the condition of hearts that only divine love could see clearly. Roman soldiers marched through Jewish streets with the confident arrogance of occupying forces whose very presence served as constant reminder that this promised land was currently under foreign control, their demands for taxes and compliance leaving families struggling to maintain both physical survival and spiritual integrity in circumstances that seemed designed to test faith beyond its breaking point. To force impossible choices between earthly survival and heavenly loyalty that no one should ever have to make, but which became daily reality for people caught between competing demands that pulled them in different directions with equal force. Into this world of political oppression and religious confusion, where hope had become a luxury few could afford, and love had been reduced to sentiment rather than transforming power that could actually change circumstances and heal relationships, and restore dignity to those who had been stripped of everything except their fundamental humanity, that no earthly authority could touch or diminish or destroy, no matter how hard they tried through methods both subtle and brutal. Jesus would soon step with a message so simple it seemed naive to sophisticated minds, yet so radical it would turn the established order upside down in the most wonderful way possible. He would demonstrate that the kingdom of heaven advances not through violence or political maneuvering that relies on human wisdom and earthly power, not through religious debate or philosophical argument that impresses intellects without changing hearts, but through the revolutionary power of unconditional love expressed in practical service to anyone who needed healing, hope, or simply the assurance that they mattered to someone whose love would never abandon them, regardless of their past mistakes or present circumstances or future fears that kept them awake at night, wondering if tomorrow would bring disaster or deliverance. Chapter 4. the beginning of something sacred. The morning sun was painting the eastern sky in watercolors of coral and amber when Jesus made his way through terrain that grew progressively more wild and rocky as he approached the banks of the Jordan River, where crowds had been gathering for weeks to hear the powerful proclamations of a desert prophet, whose message of preparation and transformation had stirred hearts throughout Palestine and beyond its borders. Drawing people from every level of society who sensed that something unprecedented was stirring in the spiritual atmosphere of their time, something that demanded response deeper than curiosity or intellectual interest but required the kind of heart change that could only come through divine encounter with truth that set souls free from bondage they had grown so accustomed to they barely recognized it as imprisonment. This was John, called the Baptist, who had grown up in wilderness places far from the comfortable compromises of city life, where spiritual truth was often diluted to make it more palatable to ears that preferred pleasant lies to challenging realities, sustained by locusts and wild honey that spoke of complete dependence upon divine provision rather than human planning and calculation. Clothed in rough camel's hair that announced his separation from the soft luxuries that so often accompany spiritual compromise and moral flexibility, his entire being radiating the intensity of someone who had spent years in solitude, learning to distinguish the voice of the Almighty from the countless other voices that compete for human attention in a world full of distractions, specifically designed to keep souls from the quiet contemplation necessary for divine communication. The Baptist's voice carried across the flowing water with the authority of ancient prophecy being fulfilled in real time before the eyes of anyone with spiritual perception to recognize what was happening in this remote location that had been chosen not for its convenience or accessibility but for its symbolic significance as place of cleansing and renewal. Calling people not to mere modification of external behavior that left hearts unchanged but to complete transformation of mind and spirit and purpose that would affect every aspect of their existence, challenging them to genuine repentance that went far deeper than surface observance of religious customs that had lost their power to change lives because they had been divorced from the love that was supposed to flow through every commandment like life-giving water through channels that had become clogged with pride and tradition. The multitudes that came to him represented every stratum of Palestinian society. Wealthy merchants whose financial success had not filled the emptiness in their souls that money could not purchase or possessions could not satisfy. Desperate beggars whose poverty had taught them truths about dependence and trust that prosperity often obscures behind illusions of self-sufficiency and personal control. Learned scribes whose vast knowledge of religious law had somehow failed to produce the wisdom and peace they had expected to find through their scholarly pursuits. Simple farmers and fishermen whose closeness to soil and sea and seasonal rhythms had prepared their hearts to recognize authentic spiritual authority when they encountered it without need for credentials or institutional approval. All of them were sensing that this wild-looking prophet spoke truths their hearts had been longing to hear even when their minds could not fully grasp the implications of what he was proclaiming with such passionate conviction and unwavering certainty. Truths that resonated in the deepest chambers of their beings where divine image still flickered despite years of neglect and abuse and systematic attempts to extinguish what could never be completely destroyed because it had been placed there by creative love that would not allow its masterpiece to be totally ruined by forces that opposed its purposes and intentions for human flourishing. Tax collectors who had grown comfortable with their collaboration with Roman authorities, their betrayal of their own people in exchange for financial security that had cost them their souls and separated them from communities that viewed them as traitors willing to profit from oppression and injustice, found themselves under conviction so powerful they could no longer pretend that prosperity purchased through compromise was worth the price. They had paid in self-respect and social standing, and spiritual integrity that once lost proved difficult to recover through any amount of wealth or status or influence they might accumulate through their ethically questionable activities. Their questions to John revealed hearts that had not been completely hardened by years of moral flexibility and ethical accommodation. Souls that still remembered what integrity felt like and longed to experience again the peace that comes from alignment between beliefs and actions, values and choices, the image of God within them and the lives. They lived in a world that watched and judged, and often found their witness wanting because it spoke more loudly through their compromises than through their professions of faith or loyalty to principles they claimed to value above material gain. Soldiers trained in violence and intimidation, men whose profession required them to think primarily in terms of enemies and threats rather than friends and opportunities, whose survival depended on readiness to inflict pain and death upon others who might challenge their authority or threaten their interests or resist the imperial power they represented through their presence and their willingness to use force when persuasion failed to achieve desired compliance, asked what they must do to live lives pleasing to the God they had been taught to fear, but had never learned to love in ways that transformed their understanding of what it meant to be human. Their weapons lay temporarily set aside as they contemplated the revolutionary possibility that there might be different ways to find security and meaning than through the application of superior force and the cultivation of fear in hearts that perhaps hungered for protection rather than domination, for justice rather than mere order, maintained through superior firepower and willingness to use it without hesitation or mercy against anyone who disturbed the peace that served Roman interests more than human flourishing or divine purposes that valued every soul as precious, regardless of nationality or social status or economic position. Religious leaders arrived from Jerusalem and surrounding areas to investigate this new teacher, who was drawing such large crowds and creating such disturbance in the established patterns of religious life, some with genuinely seeking hearts that had grown weary of empty rituals and meaningless ceremonies that satisfied neither divine requirements nor human longings for authentic connection with the living God, who desired relationship more than ritual performance. Others with suspicious minds already prepared to find fault with anyone whose message challenged their carefully maintained positions of authority and influence within systems that served their personal interests more than they served divine purposes or human needs, crying out for compassionate response. Pharisees and Sadducees, who normally maintained careful distance from each other because of doctrinal differences that had hardened into institutional rivalries and theological disputes that generated more heat than light, found themselves standing side by side in the muddy shallows of Jordan River, united temporarily by shared concern about this desert preacher whose call to repentance made no exceptions for religious credentials or family heritage or social position or any of the external markers they had learned to use as evidence of divine favor and spiritual superiority over common people. They considered less disciplined and knowledgeable about the finer points of scriptural interpretation. The baptism that John offered in the flowing waters of Jordan was far more than ritual washing designed to fulfill ceremonial requirements or satisfy religious obligations that had become ends in themselves, rather than means to the greater end of knowing God personally, but rather a powerful symbol of death and rebirth that spoke to something deeper than surface cleanliness, representing the complete transformation that begins when old life with all its failures and compromises is buried beneath waters that close over heads full of regrets and emerges, dripping with possibilities for new beginnings that divine grace makes available to anyone willing to admit their need for cleansing. They cannot provide for themselves through human effort or religious performance. Those who submitted to this baptism were acknowledging Publicly, their recognition that they needed purification from sins that stained souls more deeply than dirt stains clothing, that they hungered for righteousness they could not achieve through their own efforts, no matter how sincere or sustained, that they were ready to participate in divine purposes that transcended their individual understanding and personal ambitions and comfortable assumptions about how life should be lived. And what God required from human beings who claimed to love Him, but often lived as if His commandments were suggestions rather than expressions of wisdom designed to produce flourishing rather than restriction. Then came a morning that began like so many others, but would be remembered as long as human hearts beat with hope for redemption, as long as souls search for meaning beyond material success and temporary pleasure, as long as creation itself groans for the liberation that only divine intervention can provide through love willing to pay any price for the freedom of those it cherishes beyond human ability to comprehend or appreciate fully. Jesus appeared among the crowd gathered at the river's edge, not as spectator observing religious phenomenon from safe distance, but as participant, seeking to identify completely with humanity's need for purification and renewal. His presence so ordinary that most people noticed nothing unusual about this particular candidate for baptism, who waited patiently among others, whose sins were obvious while his own righteousness was so completed, was invisible to eyes that had grown accustomed to spotting moral failure, but had lost the ability to recognize perfect goodness. When John saw him approaching through the multitude of people pressing toward the water with desperate hope and desperate need written on faces that told stories of disappointment and failure and longing for something better than what their experience had taught them to expect from a world that breaks more promises than it keeps, something in the Baptist spirit recognized immediately that this was the moment for which his entire ministry had been preparation. The arrival of the one whose coming he had been announcing with prophetic certainty, though he had never seen his face until this historic morning that would divide human history into before and after, into prophecy and fulfillment, into shadow and substance, into promise and reality walking among them in flesh and blood that could be touched and embraced and crucified, but could never be defeated because it carried within itself the power of life over death. John's initial protest revealed his intuitive grasp of the cosmic reversal taking place before his eyes, his recognition that, in the presence of this particular candidate for baptism, all normal categories and expectations were being turned upside down in ways that challenged everything he thought he understood about worthiness and need, and the direction in which help should flow between human beings, that he was the one who needed what Jesus had to offer rather than the other way around. That the servant was suddenly face to face with his master, the forerunner confronting the one whose way he had been preparing through months of preaching that had drawn thousands to these muddy banks but had all been leading to this single moment. But Jesus insisted gently that this baptism was necessary, not because he needed cleansing, but because he needed to demonstrate complete identification with human experience, including the longing for purification that drives souls to seek renewal they cannot achieve through their own efforts, the hunger for righteousness that can only be satisfied by divine intervention in hearts that have tried everything else and found it wanting, the desire to fulfill all righteousness not by avoiding human need, but by entering fully into it as representative and substitute for all who would ever need what he came to provide through his perfect life and sacrificial death. As Jesus descended into Jordan's flowing waters that had witnessed so many symbolic deaths and rebirths, the very atmosphere around the river seemed to shimmer with anticipation and expectancy, as if all creation recognized that something unprecedented was occurring, something that would mark the beginning of ministry destined to transform not just individual lives, but the entire trajectory of human history, the relationship between heaven and earth. The understanding of what divine love looks like when it takes human form and walks among mortals whose hearts have forgotten how to hope for redemption that costs them nothing but pride, healing that requires nothing but admission of need, forgiveness that demands nothing but acknowledgement of guilt and willingness to receive mercy freely offered. When Jesus emerged from the water, droplets streaming from his hair and beard, but his face radiant with something far more significant than physical refreshment or ceremonial cleanliness, the heavens opened in a way that several witnesses would later describe as more profound than any natural phenomenon they had ever observed in lifetimes spent watching weather patterns and seasonal changes that governed agricultural cycles and daily routines, but had never prepared them for supernatural intervention that revealed dimensions of reality normally hidden from human perception, but occasionally breaking through in moments of divine self-disclosure that left observers forever changed. The Spirit of the living God descended upon him in the form of a dove, that ancient symbol of peace and new beginnings, whose gentle landing upon his head spoke of divine approval so complete it needed no words to communicate what every heart present understood intuitively. That this was the beloved in whom divine love found perfect expression, the Son in whom paternal pride reached its fullest satisfaction, the one through whom eternal purposes would be accomplished, despite temporary appearances of failure that would test the faith of everyone who chose to follow him through valleys of confusion and up mountains of revelation where partial understanding would give way to complete clarity about divine methods that often seem like foolishness to human wisdom. Then came the voice, audible to some though not to all, words that revealed the eternal relationship between Father and Son while announcing to anyone with ears to hear that the long-awaited time had finally arrived, that centuries of prophecy were about to find their fulfillment in this carpenter from Nazareth, who had just submitted to baptism like any other repentant sinner despite his complete freedom from anything requiring forgiveness or cleansing or transformation, except in the sense that his human nature needed to experience everything that makes human existence what it is, including the longing for divine approval that drives hearts to seek assurance they are loved and accepted and valued beyond their ability to earn such affection. "This is my beloved Son," the voice declared with authority that echoed across water and through centuries to every heart that has ever wondered about its standing before the throne of infinite holiness, in whom I am well pleased. These words carried hope to every soul that has questioned whether divine love could possibly extend to failures and disappointments that seem too numerous to count, too shameful to confess, too persistent to overcome through human effort, that always falls short of perfect righteousness required for fellowship with perfectly holy God, whose standards never lower to accommodate human weakness, but whose grace always rises to meet human need with provision that exceeds every requirement. Chapter 5. Words that changed everything on a hillside that rose gently from the northwestern shore of the Sea of Galilee, where wildflowers carpeted the grass in brilliant tapestries of scarlet and gold and purple, that spoke of divine artistry too magnificent for human duplication despite the greatest efforts of the most talented painters and artists who had ever attempted to capture on canvas the glory that nature displays without effort or self-consciousness. Where morning air carried the fresh sweetness of water and growing things that had never known the pollution of industrial progress or the contamination of human ambition run wild, Jesus found the perfect natural amphitheater for words that would echo through centuries and transform countless hearts long after these particular flowers had faded and new generations of blossoms had taken their place in endless cycles of beauty that teach patient hearts about renewal and hope. The crowd that had gathered to hear this rabbi, whose teaching carried power unlike anything they had experienced in synagogues, where learned men quoted other learned men in chains of interpretation that often obscured rather than illuminated the truths their souls desperately needed to hear, represented every level of Palestinian society in a mixture that would have been remarkable in any other context, but seemed natural here in the presence of one whose love recognized no artificial barriers. Created by human prejudice or social convention or religious tradition that separated people into categories of worthy and unworthy, based on external circumstances rather than the condition of hearts that only divine love could see clearly. Wealthy merchants sat beside poor laborers whose calloused hands spoke of honest work that earned barely enough to feed their families from one day to the next. Learned scribes found themselves surrounded by illiterate farmers whose closeness to soil and seasons had taught them wisdom that no amount of formal education could provide about the fundamental realities of dependence and trust in partnership with forces beyond human control. Mothers holding babies shared space with elderly men whose bent backs carried the accumulated weight of decades, spent in service to others who may not have appreciated their sacrifices, but whose needs had been met. Through love that asked for no recognition or reward beyond the satisfaction of knowing they had made life better for those who came after them. What united this diverse assembly was not social status or educational background or economic position or any of the external markers that typically determined who associated with whom in communities governed by unspoken but rigidly enforced hierarchies, but hunger they all recognized in each other's faces. Longing for something their souls knew they needed, but their minds struggled to name or define or locate in a world that offered countless forms of temporary satisfaction, but seemed incapable of providing the lasting peace that hearts created in divine image require for true flourishing rather than mere survival from one day to the next. When Jesus began to speak, his words fell into the expectant silence like seeds into soil that had been prepared by suffering and disappointment and years of religious instruction that had somehow failed to produce the righteousness it promised or the joy it proclaimed or the peace it claimed was available to anyone willing to follow rules that seemed designed more to exclude than include, more to burden than bless, more to demonstrate human inadequacy than divine sufficiency for every need that drives souls to seek something beyond what earth can provide to hearts that know they were made for heaven, even when they cannot articulate that knowledge in terms that satisfy intellectual skepticism or academic analysis. Each phrase he spoke carried both immediate comfort for hearts weary of striving without achieving and long-term challenge that would require complete transformation of values and priorities and assumptions about what constitutes true success, genuine happiness, lasting security in a world where everything people typically trust eventually proves inadequate to bear the weight of ultimate hope that human hearts place upon finite things that were never designed to carry such enormous expectations, or satisfy such deep longings, or provide such complete fulfillment as souls demand from their chosen sources of meaning and purpose and identity. He did not speak in the technical language that religious professionals use to display their expertise or impress congregations with their learning. Words that demonstrated scholarship but did not touch hearts or change lives or inspire hope that transcended earthly circumstances. Nor did he employ the elaborate rhetoric that political leaders used to manipulate emotions and secure support for policies that served their interests more than the common good of people who trusted them with power that was meant to be used for service rather than self-advancement or institutional preservation that often required sacrificing the welfare of individuals for the supposed benefit of systems that had lost sight of their original purpose. Instead, his words were so simple that children could understand their surface meaning, yet so profound that the wisest philosophers would spend lifetimes exploring depths they had glimpsed in moments of insight, granted by grace rather than achieved through academic study or intellectual effort that often produces knowledge without wisdom, information without understanding. Facts without the transforming truth that changes hearts and heals souls and restores hope to spirits that have been crushed by the weight of trying to make sense of existence that seems random and meaningless, without reference to purposes larger than human ambition or personal satisfaction. Blessed are the poor in spirit, he began, and immediately the world's understanding of blessing was revolutionized in ways that challenged every assumption people had made about divine favor and human worthiness. Every comfortable conclusion they had reached about who deserved good things and who could expect divine attention and care and provision for their needs, both physical and spiritual. In a culture that equated material prosperity with spiritual blessing and interpreted earthly success as evidence of heavenly approval, where wealth was seen as reward for righteousness and poverty as punishment for sin or lack of faith or insufficient effort or divine disfavor expressed through circumstances that seemed to contradict promises about blessing and abundance, Jesus was declaring that those who recognize their spiritual poverty, their complete inadequacy to meet divine standards through their own efforts, their desperate need for grace they could not earn or deserve or claim as right, but could only receive as gift, were the ones most positioned to receive the infinite wealth of divine love. The kingdom of heaven, he explained with authority that came from personal knowledge rather than theoretical speculation or scholarly research that had never been tested through actual experience with the realities he described, belonged to them not despite their emptiness, but because of their readiness to be filled with divine righteousness they could never achieve through human effort, no matter how sincere or sustained. Divine love they could never earn through perfect performance that remained forever beyond human capability. Divine acceptance they could never secure through flawless obedience to laws that revealed their need without providing their supply, that diagnosed their spiritual disease without offering their cure, that pointed toward standards they could never reach through striving, that exhausted bodies and frustrated minds and discouraged hearts. Blessed are those who mourn, he continued, his voice carrying comfort that penetrated hearts carrying grief so deep they had wondered if joy would ever return to lives that had been shattered by losses too painful to accept, too final to reverse, too devastating to understand within any framework that made sense of divine goodness in a world where such terrible things happened to people who had tried to live faithfully and love generously and trust completely in promises that seemed to have been forgotten by the one who made them or proven false by circumstances that appeared to contradict everything they had been taught about divine care and protection and provision for those who put their faith in heavenly love rather than earthly security. Their tears were not evidence of divine displeasure or spiritual failure or lack of faith that should be overcome through greater effort or more positive thinking or better understanding of divine principles, but precious offerings treasured by heaven with intimate care that notices every drop and remembers every sorrow and promises healing for broken hearts that human comfort cannot reach and human wisdom cannot explain and human strength cannot restore to wholeness. Healing that comes from sources beyond earthly understanding, but not beyond divine love that specializes in making beauty from ashes, and joy from mourning and praise from spirits that have been crushed by circumstances but not destroyed by them, because they have found in divine love something stronger than any earthly force. Sorrow itself, in the mysterious economy of divine love that operates according to principles completely different from worldly wisdom about happiness and success and the good life that culture promotes through advertising and entertainment, and educational systems that teach people to expect fulfillment through achievement and acquisition and recognition rather than through relationship with the source of all good things, became pathway to comfort that could only come from the ultimate source of consolation, joy that emerged not despite grief, but through grief that had been transformed by divine alchemy from poison into medicine, from ending into beginning, from death into resurrection life that proves stronger than every force that opposes human flourishing and divine purposes. Blessed are the meek, Jesus declared with quiet authority that demonstrated the very quality he was describing, transforming gentleness from weakness into strength and humility, from failure into the path to true greatness that lasts beyond earthly recognition or reward, beyond human applause or institutional honors that fade like flowers in summer heat, but leave no lasting impact on hearts that hunger for significance, that transcends temporal boundaries and touches eternity where real rewards await those who serve without expecting immediate payment for their faithfulness and love, without demanding reciprocation for their generosity. In a society where power belonged to those willing to seize it through force or cunning manipulation of others, who could be used as stepping stones toward personal advancement, where success required aggressive self-promotion and ruthless elimination of competition that stood in the way of individual achievement, where survival seemed to demand hardness of heart and calculating selfishness that treated other people as obstacles to overcome or resources to exploit rather than fellow travelers on the difficult journey of life who deserved compassion and assistance rather than opposition and exploitation. Jesus was revealing that ultimate victory belonged to those whose strength expressed itself through tenderness toward the vulnerable and service to those in need. The earth itself, he promised with certainty that carried the weight of divine decree backed by power that had spoken worlds into existence and could speak new realities into being whenever love required such demonstration of authority over all forces that oppose divine purposes for creation, would ultimately belong not to those who grasp for territory through violence or accumulated possessions, through greed or dominated others through manipulation and intimidation, but to those whose gentle spirits reflected the character of divine love that conquers through service rather than force, that leads through example rather than coercion, that transforms enemies into friends, through persistent kindness that eventually melts the hardest hearts and opens the most tightly closed minds and reaches the most carefully protected souls with truth too beautiful to resist when it is clothed in love. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, he proclaimed to hearts that had grown weary of their own moral failures and desperate for the kind of goodness that seemed forever beyond their reach despite sincere efforts to live according to divine standards that exposed their inadequacy while providing no power to achieve what they demanded from human nature that had been damaged by sin and weakened by years of choosing lesser goods over greater ones. Immediate pleasure over lasting satisfaction, easy paths over difficult ones that led to destinations worth reaching, despite the cost of the journey required to arrive there. For they will be filled, he promised with confidence that came from perfect knowledge of divine character and purposes that never fail to provide exactly what seeking hearts need most. Not through their own efforts to generate righteousness, through moral improvement programs or religious exercises that produced external compliance without internal transformation, but through divine gift of righteousness that comes to those who recognize their need and open their hearts to receive what they could never earn or deserve or achieve through human effort, but could only accept through faith that trusts completely in divine grace rather than human performance that always falls short of perfect standards required for fellowship with perfectly holy God, whose righteousness becomes their righteousness through relationship rather than achievement. Blessed are the merciful, Jesus taught with authority that would soon be demonstrated through his own merciful treatment of everyone who came to him, seeking forgiveness or healing or simply acceptance. They had been unable to find anywhere else in a world that seemed determined to judge and condemn and exclude rather than embrace and restore and welcome home those who had wandered far from love, but still carried within their hearts the capacity to recognize it when they encountered it in its purest form. For they will be shown mercy. This revealed divine principle, that mercy given creates mercy received, that forgiveness offered opens hearts to receive forgiveness, that grace extended to others becomes grace experienced in return, not through mechanical law of reciprocity, but through spiritual reality, that those who understand divine mercy are positioned to receive it in ways that those who insist on judgment for others cannot access, because they have closed their hearts to the very quality they need most desperately for their own healing and restoration. Chapter 6. Miracles of Compassion. As word of Jesus' extraordinary teaching spread, like ripples across the still surface of Galilee's social landscape, reaching into villages and towns where stories of hope and healing traveled faster than any Roman messenger could carry official dispatches with their cold, bureaucratic language that spoke of taxation and compliance, but never of transformation or renewal. Where conversations around wells and in marketplaces began to center on this carpenter-turned-teacher whose words carried weight that pressed against hearts and opened them to possibilities they had never dared imagine. Something else began to happen that amazed everyone who witnessed it firsthand or heard. Reliable accounts from neighbors whose integrity vouched for the truth of testimonies that challenged every natural law yet were corroborated by too many credible witnesses to dismiss as wishful thinking or mass hysteria, or the kind of religious enthusiasm that creates its own false evidence. The same divine power that flowed through his teachings like living water through channels that had been dry for generations began manifesting itself in healings and restorations that defied medical explanation, while demonstrating the heart of divine love toward every form of suffering that mars the beauty of creation and breaks the hearts of creatures made in the image of perfect wholeness, created for harmony and health and joy that sin and death and all their accompanying miseries had stolen from human experience, but which divine love was determined to restore through means that surpassed human understanding, while serving human need with precision that revealed intimate knowledge of every condition and perfect wisdom about how to address each unique situation. These were not theatrical displays designed to impress crowds, or validate theological credentials, or establish institutional authority that could be leveraged for personal gain or political influence, but spontaneous responses to human need that revealed what divine compassion looks like when it encounters pain and brokenness with power sufficient to restore what was lost and heal what was wounded and make whole what had been fractured by living in a world where things go wrong and bodies break down and hopes are disappointed and dreams die slow deaths that leave souls wondering if healing is possible, or wholeness is achievable, or restoration is anything more than cruel fantasy that torments hearts with desires that can never be fulfilled through earthly means or human effort. In the busy fishing village of Capernaum, where morning air carried the mingled scents of nets drying in, Mediterranean sun and bread baking in ovens tended by women whose hands had learned to transform simple grain into nourishment that sustained families through seasons of plenty and seasons of want, where the sounds of commerce and conversation created the familiar symphony of community life that had been disturbed by crisis that brought fear into homes that had known security and stability. A Roman centurion's beloved servant lay dying on a bed that had become his prison, consumed by fever that burned away his strength and paralysis that stole his mobility, leaving him completely dependent on others for every need. This military officer, though representing occupying forces that many Jews regarded as enemies of everything they held sacred about their faith and their identity as chosen people called to serve purposes larger than any earthly empire, had somehow transcended the ethnic and political barriers that typically separated conqueror from conquered by demonstrating fairness in his dealings and genuine care for the people under his authority. that went far beyond mere professional duty or calculated self-interest, designed to maintain order and prevent rebellion that might threaten his position or bring punishment from superior officers, who measured success primarily in terms of compliance and lack of disturbance rather than human welfare or justice. His love for Jewish customs and respect for Jewish faith had moved him to fund the construction of their local synagogue with his own resources, not as political gesture designed to win favor or maintain peace through strategic investment in local religious infrastructure, but as authentic expression of appreciation for spiritual truths that had touched his heart, despite his foreign birth and military training that might have hardened him against such influences and made him cynical about religion as mere superstition that weakened rather than strengthened human character and resolve to face the harsh realities of existence without illusions about divine care or intervention. When news reached him that Jesus was approaching Capernaum, something in the centurion's spirit that had been trained to recognize genuine authority through years of military service under various commanders and in various campaigns recognized that this teacher from Nazareth possessed authority of completely different kind than any earthly power he had known. Authority that came not from position or weapons or political connections, but from source that transcended human understanding while speaking directly to human hearts that knew they were in the presence of something greater than themselves, something that commanded respect not through fear, but through love. Compliance not through force, but through recognition of truth and goodness, and power exercised for blessing, rather than domination. His faith was so profound, and his understanding of spiritual authority so clear, despite his lack of formal religious training or theological education, that he sent word to Jesus through Jewish elders who could vouch for his character and petition on behalf of someone whose ethnic background might prejudice less generous hearts against his request for help. Explaining that there was no need for the teacher to actually visit his house, where ceremonial defilement might result from contact with Gentile dwelling according to religious laws that created barriers between people that divine love sought to remove. That he need only speak the word from whatever distance seemed appropriate, and healing would occur as surely as soldiers obeyed commands from legitimate authority that expected compliance without question or delay. I myself am a man under authority, he explained through his messengers with insight that amazed even Jesus, who had encountered many expressions of faith but rarely such clear understanding of how divine power operates. With soldiers under me, I tell this one, go, and he goes, and that one, come, and he comes. I say to my servant, do this, and he does it. Just say the word, and my servant will be healed. His understanding of how authority operates in the spiritual realm paralleled his experience with military hierarchy, where commands were issued with confidence that they would be obeyed, and received with certainty that compliance was not optional, but required by the structure itself that gave commanders the right to expect obedience and subordinates the obligation to provide it without debate or hesitation or partial compliance that would undermine the entire system. The faith demonstrated by this Gentile soldier amazed even Jesus, who declared to the Jewish crowds following him that he had not found such trust anywhere in Israel, among people who had been raised from childhood with stories of divine power and miraculous interventions that should have prepared them to recognize supernatural authority when it appeared among them in human form. People who had every advantage of religious heritage and scriptural knowledge but had somehow missed the simple truth that divine power operates through spoken word that calls things into existence that do not exist and transforms things that do exist into what they were meant to be before corruption and death invaded creation and twisted everything away from its original purpose. This Romang understood something about divine power that escaped many who had spent their entire lives studying scriptures and memorizing prophecies, and attending religious services, but had somehow missed the fundamental reality that divine authority operates through faith rather than religious performance, through trust rather than theological correctness, through simple acknowledgement of need and confident expectation of help rather than complex ceremonies or elaborate rituals that impressed human observers while potentially missing the heart of what God most desired from creatures made in His image for relationship rather than mere religious observance. At the very moment, Jesus spoke words of healing from miles away, without any physical contact or medical intervention or gradual process of recovery that might be explained through natural means or psychological factors that skeptics could use to dismiss the supernatural character of what occurred. The centurion's servant opened eyes that had been closed in semi-conscious delirium, caused by fever that had raged beyond the ability of any physician to control. Sat up in bed that had seemed destined to become his deathbed, according to all human prognosis based on the severity of his condition. Asked for food with appetite that had been absent for weeks as his body fought battle it appeared to be losing, and discovered that both fever and paralysis had disappeared as completely as if they had never existed, leaving behind no weakness or residual effects, but only perfect health that testified to power greater than disease, authority higher than death, love stronger than all forces that destroy what divine hands created and called good despite its current brokenness. On another day, as Jesus was teaching beside the shore where fishing boats bobbed gently in shallow water that reflected sky so perfectly it was difficult to tell where heaven ended and earth began, creating natural mirror that spoke of connection between visible and invisible realms that human eyes could glimpse but never fully comprehend without divine revelation that opened spiritual perception to realities normally hidden from natural sight, where children played in sand while their mothers listened to words that spoke to longings buried so deep in their hearts. They had almost forgotten such longings existed beneath layers of disappointment and discouragement that accumulated through years of hoping for changes that never came and prayers that seemed to go unanswered. A woman who had suffered from hemorrhaging for 12 long years pressed through the crowd that surrounded him like living wall between ordinary people and extraordinary teacher whose presence seemed to create its own atmosphere where hope became possible and healing became reality rather than distant dream. She had spent everything she owned on physicians whose treatments had only made her condition worse through procedures that promised much but delivered additional pain while draining her financial resources and leaving her not only physically weaker but economically devastated, socially isolated by religious laws that declared her ceremonially unclean and therefore unable to participate in community, worship or family celebrations or normal interactions that give life meaning and purpose beyond mere biological survival from one disappointing day to another that brought fresh reminders of limitations that seemed permanent and losses that appeared irreversible according to every human assessment of her situation. For over a decade she had lived as exile in her own town, watching life go by from margins where shame and physical suffering had relegated her, growing progressively weaker while her hope dwindled to barely visible flicker that threatened to be extinguished completely by next medical setback or financial crisis or social rejection that reminded her how completely her condition had separated her from everything that makes existence bearable, let alone enjoyable, everything that connects human beings to one another in bonds of mutual care and shared experience that she could observe but never participate in because of barriers created by circumstances beyond her control. But reports about Jesus had reached even the shadows where outcasts dwell. Stories of compassion extended to sinners and grace offered to those whom religious authorities had declared beyond divine concern. Accounts of healing that restored not just physical function, but social standing and spiritual connection and hope for futures worth living, rather than merely enduring, until death released them from suffering that seemed to serve no purpose except to demonstrate how cruel existence could become when bodies betrayed the spirits that inhabited them and medical knowledge proved inadequate to address conditions that defied understanding, let alone treatment. Her faith was desperate but certain, born from the kind of hope that emerges only when every other option has been exhausted. Yet something in the soul refuses to surrender completely to despair that would end all seeking and all believing in possibilities beyond present circumstances. Hope that exists not because of favorable evidence, but despite contrary evidence that would convince rational minds to abandon all expectation of improvement or change or divine intervention in situations that had gone on too long and become too entrenched to be reversed through any means available to human effort or medical expertise. "If I can just touch the edge of his garment," she whispered to herself as she pushed through crowd with determination, fueled by 12 years of longing for freedom from condition that had stolen her dignity along with her health, her place in community along with her physical strength, her hope for normal relationships along with her financial security that had been consumed in futile search for healing that remained beyond reach of every remedy she had tried. "I know I will be healed." Her certainty had no rational basis except deep conviction that this teacher was different from everyone else she had encountered, that his power operated according to principles she did not understand but could trust because everything she had heard about his character and his treatment of people in desperate situations suggested that he would not turn away from her need. When her trembling fingers barely grazed the hem of his cloak as he passed by, moving slowly through crowd that pressed close around him with their own needs and hopes and desperate longings for help that could only come from someone whose power transcended human limitations and whose love extended to people that society had written off as incurable or unworthy of attention from those who possessed resources to help, divine power flowed from Jesus like electricity seeking ground. And immediately she felt the hemorrhaging stop with finality that convinced her healing was complete and permanent, felt strength returning to body that had been drained by years of constant blood loss, felt shame and isolation that had defined her existence lifted away like heavy garment she had worn so long she had forgotten what it felt like to stand straight and breathe freely. Jesus, sensing that healing power had gone out from him like river flowing toward thirsty ground, stopped walking and turned to crowd with question born not of irritation at interruption of his journey but of desire to complete what had begun with physical healing by adding blessing of personal recognition and restored dignity that would matter as much as bodily restoration in life of someone who needed not just cure for her condition but acknowledgement of her worth as human being created in divine image and deserving of love and respect that her circumstances had obscured, but never destroyed, because they were rooted in divine decree rather than human evaluation. "Who touched me?" he asked gently, his question revealing heart that cared not only about miracles, but about people who received them, not only about demonstrations of power, but about relationships that power was meant to restore between God and humanity, between individuals and their communities, between suffering souls and sources of hope that could sustain them through whatever challenges might remain, even after immediate crisis had been resolved through divine intervention that addressed symptoms while never losing sight of persons whose lives had been reduced to their problems, but who were destined for so much more than their present circumstances suggested. When the woman came forward, terrified yet compelled by kindness in his voice that promised understanding rather than condemnation, acceptance rather than rejection, that she had grown accustomed to receiving from others who saw her condition before they saw her humanity, expecting rebuke for her presumption in approaching without permission or proper introduction, but receiving instead words that transformed her understanding of her own worth and place in community of faith from which she had been excluded not by divine decree, but by human interpretation of divine law, that had lost sight of divine heart toward all who suffer. Jesus looked at her with infinite tenderness that saw beyond her condition to the person she had always been in. His eyes, despite what circumstances had seemed to suggest about her value or acceptability. "Daughter," he said, and in that single word she was no longer outcast or unclean woman, or social pariah whose presence contaminated others and whose touch defiled whatever it contacted, but daughter welcomed home after long absence, family member whose place at table had been kept waiting for her return, beloved child whose worth had never been diminished in eyes of heavenly Father despite what earthly circumstances had seemed to suggest about her standing before God or her value in community of those who claim to serve him, while sometimes forgetting that service includes compassion for those whose suffering makes them inconvenient rather than inspiring. "Your faith has healed you," Jesus continued, attributing miracle not to his power alone, but to trust she had demonstrated in approaching him despite every social and religious barrier that should have kept her away. Faith that had reached across gulf of separation, created by circumstances beyond her control, to touch hem of one who had come specifically to heal broken-hearted and bind up wounded spirits wherever they might be found. Faith that refused to be deterred by obstacles that would have discouraged hearts, less desperate or less convinced that divine love was their only hope for restoration to wholeness and joy and community, belonging that every human soul was created to experience. "Go in peace and be freed from your suffering," he added, sending her away not just physically healed, but spiritually restored to fullness of life and relationship that her condition had stolen. Peace that comes not merely from absence of physical pain, but from knowledge that she was seen and known and valued by love that would never abandon her, regardless of what future challenges might arise. Freedom that extended beyond her particular medical condition to encompass liberation from every force that had conspired to convince her that she was less than fully human or unworthy of divine attention and care that never fails those who turn to it in their times of greatest need. The miracles multiplied day after day, each one revealing not just divine power, but divine heart that could not remain unmoved by human suffering in any form it took. Power that expressed itself not in spectacular displays, designed to impress observers or attract crowds that might serve political or institutional purposes, but in quiet acts of restoration that returned dignity along with health, hope along with healing, relationships along with relief from physical ailments that had isolated people from communities they needed for emotional and spiritual survival, as much as they needed medical intervention for their bodily conditions. Chapter 7. Walking among the people, what distinguished Jesus' ministry from every other religious movement of his time. What set him apart from countless other teachers and prophets and reformers who appeared throughout Palestine claiming divine authority for their particular interpretations of ancient texts or their specific programs for spiritual renewal that typically attracted followers from similar backgrounds and social circumstances, was not merely the power of his teachings or the wonder of his miracles, though both were extraordinary beyond anything his contemporaries had ever witnessed or imagined, possible within the boundaries of normal human experience, bounded by natural laws and reasonable expectations about what even divinely inspired individuals could accomplish through religious devotion and moral excellence. The truly revolutionary aspect of his approach was the way he moved through the world like someone who belonged everywhere and was welcome nowhere according to conventional social standards. The people he chose to spend time with when he could have surrounded himself with influential supporters and wealthy patrons who might have advanced his cause through political connections and financial resources. The social barriers he consistently crossed with such natural grace that observers were left breathless by the casual way he dismantled centuries of carefully constructed divisions, simply by treating every person as if they possessed infinite worth in the eyes of divine love that recognizes no artificial distinctions based on circumstances that reveal nothing about the condition of hearts hidden beneath external appearances. In bustling marketplaces where merchants hawked their wares under colorful awnings that provided relief from Mediterranean sun, while creating festive atmosphere that made commercial transactions feel more like social celebrations than mere business dealings, where air filled with sounds of bargaining conducted in multiple languages by people whose diverse backgrounds reflected Galilee's position as crossroads between different cultures and civilizations that met here in relative harmony despite their differences, where children darted between stalls displaying everything from fresh fish to imported spices, while women balanced water jars with practiced grace, developed through daily repetition of tasks that connected them to generations of mothers who had performed the same essential work. Jesus walked with relaxed familiarity of someone completely comfortable among ordinary people, living ordinary lives filled with extraordinary dignity that came from being image bearers of divine love. Whether they recognized that identity or not, unlike religious leaders who maintained careful distance from anyone whose contact might compromise their ritual purity according to complex regulations that governed every aspect of daily interaction or threatened their social standing with authorities, who valued conformity more than compassion and order, more than justice that served human need above institutional convenience. Jesus seemed to genuinely enjoy the company of tax collectors whose collaboration with Roman occupation forces had made them wealthy but spiritually impoverished, of fishermen whose honest labor connected them to rhythms older than human memory and more reliable than political promises, of former prostitutes whose past provided no barrier to present transformation, when they encountered love that saw not what they had been, but what they could become through grace that specializes in redemption rather than condemnation. He would pause at potters' workshops where skilled hands shaped clay into vessels useful and beautiful, examining their work with genuine interest while asking questions that revealed not condescension disguised as curiosity, but authentic fascination with crafts that had been passed down through generations of families, whose understanding of their work transcended mere economics to embrace something closer to worship, to partnership with creative forces that turn earth into art, raw materials into objects that serve human need while reflecting divine beauty that speaks to souls hungry for evidence that this world contains more than random collision of atoms governed by impersonal laws that care nothing for human longing or divine purpose. At bakers' stalls were warm fragrances of fresh bread, mixed with conversations about weather and politics and community news that connected neighbors to shared life that extended beyond individual concerns to encompass collective hopes and fears and dreams that bound them together in invisible networks of mutual care despite their differences in background and belief. Jesus would breathe deeply of scents that reminded him of his mother's kitchen, where love was expressed through meals prepared with care that nourished more than bodies, that fed souls hungry for evidence that someone cared enough about their well-being to invest time and effort in providing sustenance that spoke of home and belonging, and acceptance that asked no questions about worthiness, but simply responded to need with generosity that reflected divine love's abundance. His words transformed everyday experiences into windows through which listeners could glimpse eternal realities normally hidden behind veils of familiarity that make miraculous seem mundane, and sacred appear ordinary until someone with eyes to see and voice to explain reveals depths of meaning that had been present all along but required divine revelation to become visible to hearts that had grown accustomed to surface appearances rather than underlying truths that give significance to moments. that might otherwise seem trivial or forgettable, but actually pulse with purpose that connects temporal activities to eternal designs that encompass all creation in patterns, too vast for human understanding to grasp completely. Children seemed especially drawn to Jesus with instinctive recognition that bypassed intellectual analysis and went straight to heart's understanding of who could be trusted with fears and dreams and questions that adults often dismissed as unimportant or naive, but which actually represented purest expressions of human need for love that accepts without condition, guidance that leads without manipulation, protection that never fails even when circumstances suggest otherwise to minds that have learned to doubt what hearts know to be true about divine care for those who remain open to receiving it, through childlike faith that trusts without requiring proof. They sensed in him the kind of adult who would listen to their concerns without condescension, that pretends interest while actually dismissing their significance, who would enter into their games without embarrassment, that considers such activities beneath the dignity of important people with serious responsibilities, who would take seriously their observations about life that often revealed truths that sophisticated minds had overlooked or dismissed as childish simplicity when they actually contained wisdom that adults had forgotten through years of learning to ignore wonder in favor of worry, to replace curiosity with cynicism that poses as maturity, but actually represents loss of capacity for amazement. When his disciples attempted to discourage such interruptions, thinking their master's time was too valuable to be spent on those who could contribute nothing to his mission except distraction from more important work of teaching adults who had influence and resources that might advance kingdom purposes through channels that children could never provide. Jesus' response revealed the heart of his entire approach to ministry and relationship, and the values that would characterize communities formed in his name when they remembered his example rather than substituting human wisdom for divine priorities that often seem upside down to minds trained by world standards. "Let little children come to me," he said with authority that stopped his disciples' protective intervention while revealing truth they had not yet grasped about nature of kingdom he had come to establish, "and do not hinder them, for kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these." In their unguarded trust that had not yet learned to doubt promises made by those who claimed to love them, in their capacity for wonder that found miracles in ordinary moments and saw beauty in simple things that cost nothing but revealed everything about divine character, in their willingness to believe good things about people they had just met rather than approaching every new relationship with suspicion and calculation that adults had learned through painful experience. Jesus found perfect illustrations of faith that opens hearts to receive divine love without reservation. He would sit on ground with them, regardless of dust that gathered on robes, that marked him as teacher deserving respect according to social conventions that governed interactions between those of different status and age, listening to their excited chatter about treasures they had discovered or adventures they had imagined, entering into their world with such genuine delight that they forgot he was anyone other than friend who cared about what mattered to them, and understood that sometimes what matters most to children reveals truths that escape adult attention because maturity often means learning to ignore wonder in favor of practical concerns that crowd out spiritual perception. Their presence reminded everyone watching that Jesus valued people not for what they could contribute to his cause through influence or resources or talents that might prove useful in advancing his mission, but for who they were as beloved children of Heavenly Father whose love extends to everyone regardless of age or status or usefulness in accomplishing earthly goals that often distract from heavenly purposes. As representatives of values that will ultimately triumph when earthly kingdoms have crumbled and heavenly kingdom stands forever as testimony to love's victory over every force that opposes human flourishing. When Samaritan woman approached Jacob's well during noon heat, timing her visit to avoid other women who normally gathered there in cooler morning hours when social interaction made necessary. Chore of drawing water into opportunity for community connection and information exchange. She expected to complete her task in solitude and return home without encountering anyone who might remind her of shame and disappointment that had marked her recent years with series of failed relationships that had left her isolated even among people who were themselves outcasts from Jewish perspective due to ancient ethnic and religious divisions that created hostility between communities that should have been united by common heritage and shared faith. The last thing she anticipated was finding Jewish rabbis sitting beside well that held significance for both their peoples as symbol of divine provision and faithfulness that transcended tribal boundaries, and she certainly never imagined that he would speak to her in violation of every social convention governing interactions between Jews and Samaritans, men and women, religious teachers and social outcasts whose very presence was considered contaminating by those who prided themselves on ritual purity and moral superiority that created barriers between people rather than bridges that divine love seeks to build. The conversation that unfolded revealed both Jesus' supernatural knowledge of her personal history that no stranger could possess through normal means, and his profound compassion for loneliness and searching that had driven her from one relationship to another in futile attempt to find someone who could satisfy deep thirst of her heart for love that would never disappoint or abandon her when difficulties arose or novelty wore off and human limitations became apparent through daily contact that revealed flaws and weaknesses that initial attraction had not anticipated or prepared her to handle with patience and understanding. Instead of condemnation, she expected from religious teacher whose training would have taught him to judge her choices and find her wanting according to standards that measured worth through moral performance and social respectability. He offered her living water, the kind that would spring up from within her own soul and become source of satisfaction that no earthly relationship could provide or destroy. Eternal spring that would never run dry regardless of circumstances or human failures, that had taught her not to expect permanence or faithfulness from anyone who claimed to care about her welfare and happiness, but proved unable to sustain such care through difficulties that tested every promise and revealed the difference between genuine love and mere attraction or convenience. By the time their conversation ended, this woman who had come to well burdened with secrets and sorrow and shame that had grown heavier with each disappointment left her water jar behind in her excitement and ran back to very town where she had been living as something of outcast, so transformed by her encounter with unconditional acceptance that she could not contain news that had to be shared with anyone willing to listen to testimony of someone whose life had been changed by meeting one who knew everything about her but chose to offer grace instead of judgment, hope instead of condemnation, invitation to new life instead of reminder of past failures that had defined her identity until this moment of divine encounter. Chapter 8. Fellow Seekers of Peace. As we pause here together in our sacred journey through the life and love of this extraordinary man who walked among the people of his time with such revolutionary grace, my beloved companion on this path toward the rest that your weary soul has been seeking through all the noise and chaos of days that have asked more of your heart than seemed humanly possible to give, without breaking under the accumulated weight of caring for a world that often seems indifferent to the suffering of those who love most deeply. I want to take a moment to acknowledge something beautiful and profound that has been happening in the quiet chambers of your spirit as we have breathed together the same holy air that surrounded Jesus during those remarkable years when heaven touched earth in ways that transformed everything they encountered. You are not alone in this experience of encountering something larger and more tender than your troubles. Through these timeless narratives that speak across centuries to address needs that remain essentially unchanged, despite all the technological advances and cultural developments that have transformed external circumstances of human existence while leaving deepest hungers of human hearts, exactly as they were when Jesus first spoke words of comfort to crowds gathered on Galilean hillsides where wildflowers painted grass with colors no earthly artist has ever managed to duplicate completely, where morning air carried promises of hope to spirits that had almost forgotten how to believe in possibilities beyond their immediate circumstances. All around our world tonight, other souls exactly like yours have found their way to this same sanctuary of contemplation. Other weary hearts seeking the same rest you are discovering in these moments of quiet reflection. Other searching spirits drawn by the same irresistible pull towards something they cannot name, but cannot ignore. Something that feels like coming home to a place they have never been, but somehow recognize as the destination toward which their deepest longings have always been. Pointing through years of looking in all the wrong places for satisfaction that could only come from relationship with the one who created those longings as invitation to divine fellowship. There is something profoundly moving about this invisible community of seekers that has formed around these sacred stories, this fellowship of hearts that spans continents and cultures and centuries. United not by geography or background or shared external circumstances, but by common recognition that our souls were made for more than the endless cycle of stress and striving that characterizes so much of contemporary existence, that our hearts contain chambers that can only be filled by connection with love that never fails and never abandons and never grows weary of extending grace to those who have exhausted their own resources and discovered that human strength is insufficient for challenges that life presents to anyone who lives long enough to encounter the kind of pain that breaks hearts and the kind of loss that steals hope. Some who join us in this quiet contemplation tonight are longtime pilgrims whose feet have walked these pathways of faith for many decades, whose hearts have been seasoned by years of learning to distinguish between voices that promise much but deliver little, and the voice that speaks with authority derived not from human credentials but from divine love that proves itself faithful through seasons of abundance and seasons of scarcity, through times of clarity when purposes seem obvious and times of confusion when nothing makes sense except the steady presence of love that remains, constant when everything else changes, that provides anchor for souls when storms of life threaten to wash away everything they thought they could count on for security and meaning, and hope that tomorrow might be better than today. Others may be newer to this kind of spiritual exploration, their hearts cautiously opening to possibilities. They may have dismissed in earlier chapters of their lives, when cynicism seemed like wisdom and skepticism felt like necessary protection against disappointment that comes when hearts dare to believe in goodness that seems too beautiful to be real, too generous to be true, too wonderful to be available to ordinary people like themselves who have made too many mistakes and carry too many regrets and bear too many wounds to qualify for the kind of love that songs celebrate and poets describe and preachers proclaim, but which seems reserved for those fortunate enough to be born with naturally righteous inclinations. Whether you arrive in this peaceful space as seasoned traveler whose spiritual passport bears stamps from many encounters with divine grace, or as curious newcomer, taking tentative first steps into territories that feel both foreign and mysteriously familiar, like landscapes glimpsed in dreams that seem more real than waking life, you are equally welcome in this community of hearts that have learned to recognize their need for something beyond what the visible world can provide to souls created for relationship with invisible love that makes itself known through countless expressions of beauty and goodness and truth that speak to anyone whose heart remains open to possibility that this universe contains more than random, arrangement of matter governed by impersonal forces. The very fact that you have chosen to spend these precious evening hours in contemplation of eternal things, rather than consuming entertainment that demands nothing of your heart or mind and returns nothing to your soul, speaks to something beautiful awakening within you. Some deep recognition that your spirit was made for communion with love itself, rather than settling for substitutes that promise satisfaction but deliver only temporary distraction from longings that return with renewed intensity once distraction ends, substitutes that leave you hungrier after consuming them than you were before, because they were never designed to fill the God-shaped hollow within your heart that only divine love can satisfy. If these stories of Jesus' compassion toward outcasts and sinners have stirred something beautiful in your spirit tonight, if his interactions with children and tax collectors and fishermen and all the ordinary people who found in his presence the extraordinary grace they had been seeking without knowing where to look or how to ask, or whether they had any right to expect such generosity from a source that had seemed distant and demanding, rather than near and welcoming. If his patient love for confused disciples who asked obvious questions and made embarrassing mistakes yet were chosen for purposes that exceeded their understanding has helped you believe that you too might be worthy of such tender acceptance, despite everything that whispers otherwise in hours when doubt seems more reasonable than faith, then I want to extend to you the same invitation that Jesus offered to everyone whose path crossed his during those transformative years. You are invited to become part of our growing family of fellow seekers who have discovered that spiritual rest is not luxury reserved for those who have achieved some level of spiritual maturity or theological understanding, but necessity as fundamental to human flourishing as food and water and air. That these quiet moments of encounter with divine love are not optional additions to life that can be postponed until more convenient seasons when schedules allow for such indulgences, but essential nourishment for souls that were created for relationship with their Maker and will never find true satisfaction in anything less than the love that spoke them into existence and sustains every heartbeat and every breath. By choosing to walk with us through these contemplative narratives that invite you to slow down rather than speed up, to listen rather than speak, to receive rather than achieve, to rest rather than strive, you become part of something that transcends mere content consumption, to become fellowship with people who understand that some truths can only be received when we create space for them to settle into hearts that have learned to be still in presence of divine love that never grows impatient. With our slowness to understand or our tendency to forget what we have learned about grace that meets us exactly where we are, without demanding that we become something different before we can be accepted. Your presence in this community matters more than you might realize, dear friend, because every heart that opens to divine love creates ripples that extend far beyond individual experience to bless lives of everyone whose path intersects with someone who has been touched by grace and carries that touch forward into daily interactions that become opportunities for love to multiply and spread through human connections that reveal divine care, working through ordinary people transformed by extraordinary encounter with Christ, who sees not what we have been, but what we are becoming through his patient work in depths of our being. Please know that your thoughts and reflections about this journey we are sharing together, your own experiences of encountering Jesus, through these stories that speak across centuries to address needs that remain essentially unchanged, despite all external transformations that characterize human history, are deeply valued and warmly welcomed in conversation we maintain through comments and connections that form when people risk vulnerability and share honestly about their spiritual discoveries. Without fear of judgment from those who think they have progressed further along pathways that all lead to same destination, where love waits with infinite patience for every wandering child to find their way home. Your questions reveal seeking heart, and seeking hearts are exactly what divine love delights to find and satisfy. With truth that brings both comfort for present struggles and hope for future possibilities that seem impossible according to human limitations, but become possible through divine power working in cooperation with human faith that trusts completely even when understanding remains incomplete, that chooses love over fear even when circumstances suggest reasons for caution, that believes in goodness even when evidence appears to contradict such faith. In weeks and months ahead, we will continue exploring stories that possess power to heal wounded hearts and restore hope to discouraged spirits, journeying together through experiences of saints and mystics who discovered divine presence in desert silences and mountain solitudes, where noise could not distract from voice that speaks most clearly in quiet moments when souls stop long enough to listen for whispers that carry more truth than shouts that demand attention but deliver little substance. Capable of satisfying deep hunger for meaning that transcends temporal concerns, we will walk with ancient pilgrims whose footsteps were paths through landscapes of prayer and praise, whose hearts learned to find God not only in spectacular moments of obvious divine intervention but in ordinary circumstances that revealed extraordinary love working through common events to accomplish uncommon purposes that served eternal plans invisible to eyes focused only on immediate concerns and temporary solutions to problems that required eternal remedies available only through relationship with the one who created time, but exists beyond its limitations. Until we meet again in this sacred space where weary hearts find rest and searching souls discover fragments of the home they have been seeking through all their wandering in far countries where they spent their inheritance on pleasures that promised fulfillment, but delivered only emptiness that taught them to appreciate riches they had. Abandoned in pursuit of treasures that turned to dust in their hands, may you carry with you the peace you have found tonight, the love you have encountered, the hope you have received through these hours spent in contemplation of the one whose love never abandons those who turn to him in their deepest need. Chapter 9. The 12 and their stories. As Jesus' reputation continued spreading throughout Palestine like morning light, gradually illuminating landscape that had been hidden in darkness, reaching into villages where his name was whispered around evening fires, and his deeds discussed in synagogues, where learned men struggled to categorize someone who fit no existing pattern of religious teacher or political leader or social reformer they had encountered in their lifetimes of studying scriptural prophecy and observing human attempts to fulfill divine purposes through methods that typically relied more on human wisdom than divine guidance. He recognized growing need for companions who could share not only in his daily ministry, but in his deeper mission of demonstrating what divine love looked like when it took human form and walked among mortals whose hearts had grown cold from disappointment and whose spirits had been wounded by religion that burdened rather than blessed. From among the larger group of followers who had begun gathering wherever he went, drawn by teachings that spoke to longings buried so deep in their hearts, they had almost forgotten such longings existed beneath layers of practical concerns and immediate pressures that consumed most of their mental and emotional energy, attracted by healings that restored not just physical function, but hope for futures worth living rather than merely enduring until death released them from struggles that seemed endless, inspired by presence that somehow made ordinary moments feel sacred and common encounters seem charged with eternal significance that transformed routine interactions into opportunities for grace to be given and received. Jesus chose 12 men to serve as his apostles. These 12 were not the kind of men that religious establishments typically selected for positions of spiritual authority or institutional leadership. Not polished scholars who had mastered intricate details of scriptural interpretation, through years of study in prestigious schools where theological degrees were earned by memorizing commentaries written by previous generations of experts, whose wisdom had been tested through academic debate, but not necessarily through practical application in daily life among people whose needs were immediate and whose problems were real, rather than theoretical. Not socially prominent figures whose endorsement might lend credibility to new movement, or whose financial resources might provide security for organization that would need material support to accomplish spiritual purposes in world where even divine work required earthly means. Instead, Jesus chose ordinary working men whose hearts remained tender enough to recognize divine love when it called their names and invited them into adventure beyond anything their limited imaginations could have conceived during quiet moments when they wondered if their lives held any significance beyond daily routines of earning bread and caring for families, whose souls had not been hardened by success that might make them feel self-sufficient or cynical about possibilities for transformation that seemed too good to be true, to minds that had learned to expect disappointment rather than hope for fulfillment that actually satisfied longings too deep for words to express adequately. Their selection revealed Jesus' consistent preference for potential over pedigree, for willingness over worthiness, for hearts ready to be transformed rather than minds already convinced of their own completeness or spiritual maturity that would make further growth seem unnecessary or unlikely given their current level of understanding and commitment to principles they had learned through religious instruction that emphasized external compliance more than internal transformation. Performance more than relationship. Achievement more than surrender to divine will that operates according to wisdom that often contradicts human expectations about how spiritual progress should occur. Simon, whom Jesus renamed Peter with prophetic insight that looked beyond present instability to future strength that would be forged through failures that taught him complete dependence upon divine grace rather than human determination and natural ability that proved insufficient when tested by circumstances that revealed the difference between human resolve and divine power working through yielded hearts, brought to their fellowship passionate intensity of natural leader, whose enthusiasm often exceeded his wisdom, but whose love for his master ran deeper than the sea from which he had drawn his living for so many years, deeper than any human relationship he had ever experienced or imagined possible between teacher and student. Deeper than family bonds that had seemed strongest connections available to human hearts, until he encountered love that transcended every earthly category. Peter possessed the kind of personality that spoke first and thought later, that acted on impulse rather than careful reflection, that promised more than human strength could deliver, yet somehow always found reserves of divine grace sufficient for whatever challenges love placed before him, when he learned to depend not on his own resources, which proved inadequate under pressure, but on power that worked through weakness rather than despite it, that accomplished divine purposes through human frailty rather than human strength that might take credit for results that belonged entirely to divine love working through surrendered lives, that chose foolish things to shame wise things and weak things to confound strong things, according to principles that operated completely opposite from worldly wisdom. His journey from fisherman to fisher of men would take him through depths of failure that would have destroyed lesser souls who lacked his fundamental commitment to love despite his obvious imperfections, and heights of faithfulness that would inspire countless generations of believers who would find in his story encouragement for their own struggles with inconsistency and hope for their own potential despite present limitations that seemed to disqualify them for spiritual service or divine purposes that required stronger characters than they possessed according to their own honest self-assessment that made them wonder how God could possibly use such flawed instruments for such important work that demanded reliability they could not guarantee in wisdom. they did not possess. Andrew, Peter's younger brother, brought quieter but equally devoted heart to their fellowship, possessing kind of personality that preferred to work behind scenes rather than in spotlight, that attracted his more dramatic sibling, whose greatest joy came not from public recognition of his own contributions to their shared mission, but from introducing others to the teacher who had changed his life in ways that made him want to share that transformation with everyone he met, regardless of their background or circumstances or apparent readiness to receive such news, whose gift lay in recognizing potential in unlikely people and creating opportunities for them to encounter Jesus personally rather than simply hearing about him secondhand through reports that lacked the power of direct experience. Andrew's faithful service behind scenes, his willingness to take secondary role while his brother received more attention and recognition for dramatic gestures that impressed crowds and captured public imagination, his persistent efforts to bring others into circle of divine love rather than focusing on his own advancement or spiritual development that might have seemed more important to those who measured success in terms of personal growth rather than service to others, demonstrated kind of humble greatness that Jesus consistently praised above spectacular displays that impressed human observers while potentially missing divine heart that valued faithfulness in small things more than prominence in large things. James and John, sons of Zebedee, whose father had built successful fishing enterprise that provided comfortable living for their family until Jesus called them to abandon nets and boats for adventure that would prove far more rewarding than any material success they might have achieved by continuing in commercial fishing that brought temporal security, but could never satisfy longings for meaning and purpose that their souls recognized when they encountered someone whose mission connected individual lives to eternal purposes, carried nicknames that revealed their fiery temperaments and quick reactions to anything that seemed to threaten or dishonor their beloved master, whose reputation they guarded as jealously as they guarded their own family. Honor. These brothers earned title Sons of Thunder because of their readiness to call down divine judgment upon anyone who failed to receive Jesus with proper respect or showed insufficient appreciation for teachings that seemed so obviously true and beneficial that opposition could only be explained through willful blindness or deliberate wickedness that deserved immediate and severe punishment rather than patient instruction that might eventually open closed minds and soften hardened hearts. Through persistent demonstration of love that refused to give up hope for transformation, even in most difficult cases that tested faith in human potential for redemption. Their passionate natures served them well in some situations where righteous indignation was appropriate response to injustice, or boldness was needed to proclaim truth in hostile environments, where courage was required to speak words that needed to be heard, despite danger that such speaking might bring to those who dared to challenge established power structures, but their reactions often required redirection from destructive impulses toward constructive expressions of their zeal for divine honor and human welfare that would bless rather than burden those they were meant to serve with love rather than judgment that condemned without offering hope for restoration. Under Jesus' patient influence that never tried to crush their spirits but rather channeled their energy into forms that would serve divine purposes, rather than human pride that sought glory for itself, their capacity for righteous anger would be transformed into equally passionate love that would eventually cost them everything they had to give in service of others who needed what they had received through their relationship with one who had loved them enough to call them from comfortable mediocrity into glorious danger of living for purposes larger than personal satisfaction or individual security. That world offered to those willing to settle for less than what divine love made available to hearts that remained open to greater possibilities. Philip approached discipleship with careful, analytical mind of someone who liked to understand things thoroughly before committing himself completely to courses of action that might prove costly or difficult to reverse once begun, whose practical nature sometimes struggled with supernatural dimensions of following Jesus, but whose intellectual honesty kept him asking questions until he found answers satisfactory enough to justify continued participation in movement that challenged many assumptions he had held about how divine power operates in human affairs and what God expected from people who claimed to love him while often living as if his existence made little practical difference in their daily decisions. When Jesus tested Philip's faith by asking how they could possibly feed a crowd of 5,000 people with resources that seemed laughably inadequate for such enormous task that would strain the resources of wealthy individuals and organized institutions, let alone small group of disciples whose treasury was modest at best, Philip immediately began calculating costs and logistics with systematic precision that revealed his organized approach to problem solving, but also his inability to conceive solutions that transcended ordinary human resources and conventional methods for addressing overwhelming needs that appeared impossible to meet through normal means. His systematic mind missing opportunity to exercise faith in one who specialized in making much from little, who delighted in confounding human calculations with divine solutions that no amount of planning or preparation could anticipate or achieve through purely human effort. His questions were never frivolous or designed to create difficulties for their group or challenge Jesus' authority in ways that undermined confidence in their shared mission, but reflected genuine desire to understand principles that governed relationship between human effort and divine provision, between natural means and supernatural results, between faith that trusts completely in divine power and wisdom that plans carefully for contingencies that might arise when good intentions encounter practical obstacles that could derail even worthy projects unless adequate preparation has been made for challenges that experience suggests will inevitably appear to test commitment and resourcefulness. Yet his honest questions and straightforward personality made him approachable to those who sought Jesus but felt intimidated by more dramatic personalities. Among disciples whose passionate responses sometimes overwhelmed people who needed gentle introduction to concepts that challenged their understanding of how spiritual life should be lived, those who needed someone to translate profound truths into practical terms they could understand and apply to everyday situations filled with ordinary challenges requiring extraordinary faith to navigate successfully while maintaining hope and joy that didn't depend on circumstances being favorable or outcomes being certain. Nathanael, also called Bartholomew, initially approached Jesus with healthy skepticism of someone whose knowledge of geography and prophecy made him doubt that anything truly significant could emerge from villages small and insignificant as Nazareth. His honest questions revealing not cynicism that refused to consider new possibilities, but genuine desire to understand truth that could withstand careful examination. Not rejection of divine revelation, but thoughtful evaluation of claims that seemed too wonderful to believe without adequate evidence that could satisfy both heart and mind, seeking authentic encounter with living God rather than human fabrication. When Jesus demonstrated supernatural knowledge of his character and activities, describing him as true Israelite, in whom there was no deceit before they had ever met or spoken, about personal matters that only divine revelation could have revealed to stranger, Nathanael's skepticism dissolved into worship that was all the more profound because it had been preceded by honest doubt rather than uncritical acceptance of extraordinary claims that required faith to embrace fully. His transformation from skeptic to believer, becoming pattern for many who would encounter Jesus through careful questioning, that led to genuine conviction rather than superficial agreement that might collapse under pressure. Matthew brought to their group unique perspective of someone who had collaborated with Roman authorities for personal profit through occupation that made him wealthy but spiritually impoverished, who understood corruption of occupying power from inside its system where he had observed how financial gain could be pursued at expense of moral integrity and community loyalty, who knew what it meant to be despised by his own people for choices that had enriched him materially, while cutting him off from religious fellowship and social acceptance that gave meaning to existence, beyond mere accumulation of wealth that could purchase comfort but not peace, security but not satisfaction, influence but not love. His transformation from tax collector to apostle became living proof that no past was too shameful, no reputation too damaged, no heart too hardened by compromise to be reached by divine love and restored to usefulness in kingdom of heaven, where former enemies become beloved friends and former outcasts become honored members of family that includes everyone willing to receive grace, freely offered to all without regard for worthiness or merit or previous behavior that might seem to disqualify them from divine service or community fellowship that embraces those whom religious authorities had written off as hopeless cases. Thomas, forever remembered primarily for his post-resurrection doubts, rather than his pre-crucifixion courage that demonstrated tremendous loyalty when it would have been safer to distance himself from teacher, whose popularity was waning and whose enemies were growing bolder, actually showed remarkable bravery throughout his years with Jesus, volunteering to accompany his master back into dangerous territory where religious authorities had threatened his life, displaying kind of devotion that was willing to risk everything for love of one who had become more precious than life itself to hearts that had discovered meaning beyond survival and purpose beyond personal comfort. His questions and uncertainties arose not from lack of love, but from desire to understand completely, to have solid foundations for faith that could withstand testing and persecution and inevitable challenges that would come to anyone who chose to follow Jesus in a world often hostile to divine love and suspicious of claims that challenged established order and comfortable assumptions about how things should work and who deserves divine favor based on external performance rather than heart. Condition that only divine love could see clearly and judge fairly. Simon the Zealot represented yet another background entirely, bringing to their fellowship perspective of someone who had been involved with political resistance movement that sought to overthrow Roman occupation through force and revolutionary violence that promised freedom, through methods that ultimately produced more bondage. His presence among 12 alongside Matthew, who had collaborated with very forces Simon had opposed, demonstrating Jesus' remarkable ability to unite people whose natural inclinations would have made them enemies under any other circumstances where human wisdom, rather than divine love, governed relationships and determined who could associate with whom. Living in daily contact with these 11 very different personalities, each carrying his own emotional baggage and cultural expectations and theological misunderstandings about what it meant to follow Rabbi, who spoke of kingdom that operated according to principles completely different from any earthly kingdom they had ever known or imagined possible. Jesus demonstrated what it meant to love people, not because they were perfect, but because love itself is perfect. Not because they deserved affection, but because divine affection flows toward human hearts, regardless of their worthiness or readiness to receive such unmerited favor. He saw through Peter's impulsive bluster to genuine devotion that would eventually prove stronger than fear, appreciated Andrew's humble service even when it received little public recognition or acknowledgement from those who preferred dramatic gestures to quiet faithfulness, channeled Sons of Thunder's passionate energy toward constructive purposes rather than destructive expressions of zeal that might harm rather than help those they encountered in their ministry, patiently answered Philip's analytical questions while gradually expanding his understanding, beyond purely rational categories that could never fully contain mysteries of divine love. The disciples observed Jesus handling every conceivable situation with wisdom and grace that never seemed forced or artificial, but flowed naturally from his perfect understanding of both human nature and divine purpose. Watching him respond to hostile questions without losing patience or compromising truth that needed to be spoken, regardless of how unwelcome it might be to ears that preferred comfortable lies to challenging realities. Witnessing his interactions with women and children and outcasts that revealed divine love's consistency, regardless of social status or cultural expectations about whose lives mattered most. They noticed that his private character matched his public teachings in ways that gave absolute credibility to everything he claimed about divine heart toward humanity. That he practiced what he preached, not as performance for their benefit, but as natural expression of who he was in deepest places of his being, where divine nature and human nature existed in perfect harmony, without tension or contradiction or struggle between competing desires or loyalties that might pull him in different directions depending on circumstances or pressures. Through countless ordinary moments and extraordinary crises, through seasons of popularity when crowds followed them everywhere they went, and periods of opposition when enemies plotted their destruction with increasing boldness and creativity, through miracles that filled them with wonder at divine power working, through human weakness and teachings that challenged their assumptions about everything they thought they understood about God and life and meaning and purpose. These 12 men were being transformed from collection of individuals pursuing separate agendas into community of friends, united by shared love for one who had called them out of their former lives into adventure beyond anything they could have imagined. Chapter 10. Opposition and Persecution. As Jesus' influence expanded throughout Palestine, like ripples spreading across still surface of water disturbed by stone thrown from heaven, reaching into every corner of Jewish society where his teachings challenged assumptions that had been accepted without question for generations, and his presence inspired hope for changes that threatened established order, built upon carefully maintained balances of power and privilege that served institutional interests more than divine purposes or human needs crying out for compassionate response. The religious and political authorities who benefited from existing arrangements began to recognize this carpenter from Nazareth, not as welcome spiritual reformer whose message might strengthen their influence and validate their importance, but as fundamental threat to systems through which they maintained control over populations, who had grown accustomed to looking to them for guidance about divine will and earthly responsibility. What had begun as curiosity about new teacher whose methods differed from established rabbinical traditions in ways that attracted crowds but did not necessarily challenge existing power structures gradually hardened into skepticism about claims that seemed too extraordinary to accept without more evidence than miraculous healings could provide to minds trained in political calculation rather than spiritual discernment. Then evolved into active opposition that sought to discredit his authority through public challenges designed to expose weaknesses in his theology or contradictions in his practices that would justify dismissing him as dangerous deceiver whose influence needed to be contained before it spread too far among people whose enthusiasm for his message was already creating problems for those whose positions depended upon popular respect for traditional leadership. The Pharisees, who had built their entire identity around meticulous observance of religious law that distinguished them from common people they considered less spiritually disciplined and theologically informed about proper relationship between human beings and holy God, who demanded perfection they claimed to provide through careful attention to ceremonial details and ritual requirements, found themselves increasingly disturbed by Jesus' apparent disregard for traditions, They held sacred as essential expressions of covenant faithfulness that separated God's people from surrounding nations, whose moral standards and religious practices represented everything faithful. Jews were supposed to reject as incompatible with divine revelation. When his disciples picked grain on Sabbath to satisfy hunger that made concentration difficult during long day of ministry that had begun before dawn and might not end until well after sunset, when weary travelers finally found places to rest and recover strength for whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, when he healed sick people on day designated for rest that was supposed to be kept holy through abstinence from work that included medical practice, according to interpretations developed by scholars who had spent years defining boundaries between necessary and unnecessary activities, when he ate meals with tax collectors and sinners without ensuring proper ceremonial cleansing had taken place according to regulations designed to prevent contamination, he was challenging not just their practices, but their fundamental understanding of what it meant to honor divine commandments. Their objections to Jesus' behavior were not merely petty criticisms of minor infractions that revealed small-minded concern with trivial details rather than important spiritual principles, nor expressions of personal animosity toward someone whose popularity threatened their influence over populations they had grown accustomed to controlling through fear of divine displeasure if proper procedures were not followed exactly as tradition prescribed, but sincere expressions of concern about what they perceived as dangerous departures from scriptural authority and ancestral wisdom that had preserved Jewish identity through centuries of foreign occupation and cultural pressure to conform to practices that would eventually destroy everything that made them distinct as chosen people. They had dedicated their entire adult lives to learning complex requirements of religious law that governed every aspect of daily existence, from food preparation to business practices to social relationships that connected individuals to larger community of faith, creating elaborate systems designed to help ordinary people avoid accidentally violating divine commandments whose transgression might result in spiritual contamination that would separate them from holy God, who could not tolerate sin in any form or degree without compromising his perfect righteousness that formed foundation of cosmic order, protecting divine honor through careful observance of regulations that built protective fences around biblical precepts to ensure no faithful person could inadvertently cross lines that separated acceptable from forbidden behavior. Jesus' casual attitude toward their protective traditions seemed to them like dangerous carelessness at best and blasphemous rebellion at worst, suggesting either ignorance of divine requirements that any properly educated teacher should understand through years of study under qualified instructors, or deliberate contempt for authority structures that God himself had established through Moses and maintained through legitimate religious leadership that bore responsibility for interpreting and applying eternal principles to contemporary situations that required wisdom, accumulated through centuries of careful study and practical application to real problems faced by people trying to live faithfully in a world that made such faithfulness difficult, if not impossible, without expert guidance. His responses to their criticisms revealed heart issues behind their theological objections, exposing how easily religious devotion could become religious pride that valued system more than purpose it was meant to serve. How quickly concern for divine honor could transform into concern for personal reputation that depended upon being recognized as especially faithful by others, whose approval had become more important than divine approval that comes to those who understand that mercy triumphs over judgment, and love fulfills law in ways that external compliance alone can never achieve, because it flows from transformed hearts rather than merely modified behavior. When he told them that Sabbath was made for humanity rather than humanity for Sabbath, He was turning their understanding of divine purpose upside down in ways that challenged everything they had been taught about proper priorities and spiritual values that should govern relationships between creator and creation. Between divine requirements and human needs, between eternal principles and temporal applications that must be flexible enough to serve love rather than rigid enough to crush spirits, that divine law was meant to liberate from bondage to sin and fear and death that reigned before grace appeared to offer better way. The Sadducees, who controlled temple operations and their lucrative financial arrangements while maintaining careful political relationships with Roman authorities that allowed them to preserve relative autonomy in religious matters as long as they prevented disturbances that might attract unwanted attention from imperial administrators who had little patience for local customs that seemed to interfere with efficient governance. Saw Jesus primarily as threat to delicate balance they had achieved between spiritual responsibilities and political realities that required constant negotiation between competing demands. Their opposition was motivated more by practical concerns about institutional preservation than by doctrinal disagreements about theological interpretations, though they certainly disagreed with many aspects of his teaching that seemed to undermine authority structures through which they exercised influence. Over populations whose religious activities generated revenue essential for maintaining temple services and supporting priestly families whose livelihood depended upon continued functioning of sacrificial system, that Jesus appeared to be challenging through his emphasis on mercy rather than ritual performance, forgiveness rather than financial payment, relationship rather than ceremonial compliance. They understood better than most how precarious their position had become under Roman rule that tolerated local religions only as long as they posed no threat to imperial interests or social stability that required cooperation from local leaders who could be trusted to maintain order among populations that might otherwise require military intervention to prevent rebellion or civil disturbance that would be costly for Rome and catastrophic for Jewish people who had already suffered enormous losses during previous conflicts with occupying forces. The scribes and teachers of religious law, whose authority rested on their expertise in interpreting ancient texts and applying scriptural principles to contemporary situations that required careful analysis of precedent and tradition to determine proper courses of action, found themselves intellectually threatened by someone who taught with direct authority rather than citing other authorities to support his positions, as was customary. Among rabbis who built their teachings on foundations laid by previous generations of scholars and interpreters who had established accepted methods for deriving truth from sacred writings, Jesus didn't need to reference earlier rabbis or quote established commentaries to validate his teachings because he spoke with immediacy of personal knowledge that came from perfect relationship with divine source of all truth. Revealing divine will with clarity that made their elaborate scholarly debates seem irrelevant and their careful academic distinctions appear insignificant compared to transforming power of simple truth spoken with authority that came from complete alignment with Heavenly Father, whose purposes he understood intimately because he shared divine nature while maintaining genuine humanity that enabled him to bridge gap between infinite and finite. The opposition intensified as religious leaders began testing Jesus with carefully crafted questions designed to trap him in contradictions or force him to make statements that could be used against him either in religious courts that judged violations of ceremonial law or before Roman tribunals that had power to impose severe penalties, including death for those found guilty of sedition or blasphemy that threatened public order or imperial security. That took precedence over local religious concerns whenever conflicts arose between spiritual and political obligations. They asked about paying taxes to Caesar, hoping to make him choose between alienating Jewish patriots who resented foreign taxation as symbol of their subjugation and giving them grounds to accuse him of encouraging rebellion against imperial authority that would bring swift and terrible retaliation against anyone suspected of seditious activity that threatened stability Rome required for efficient administration of territories that generated wealth essential for maintaining empire that depended on cooperation from local populations, who might rebel if pushed too far by unreasonable demands or harsh treatment. Time after time, Jesus' responses demonstrated wisdom that transcended human cleverness, revealing divine understanding that could satisfy deepest requirements of both justice and mercy, both truth and love, both respect for legitimate authority and compassion for human weakness that deserved understanding rather than condemnation, forgiveness rather than punishment that crushed spirits already wounded by their own choices and circumstances beyond their control that had shaped their lives in ways they might not have chosen if better options had been available to them. Chapter 11. The Final Journey to Jerusalem. The time had come for Jesus to set his face steadfastly toward Jerusalem, and everyone who knew him could sense the profound shift in his demeanor as he prepared for what he understood with divine clarity would be his final journey to the holy city, where prophets had always come to deliver their ultimate messages and often to die for truths that religious establishments found too threatening to tolerate. Where the greatest demonstration of divine love in human history would soon unfold before a world that desperately needed to witness such complete self-sacrifice offered freely for the sake of human redemption that could be accomplished through no other means than voluntary surrender of perfect life for imperfect lives. The relaxed pace that had characterized his Galilean ministry, with its gentle rhythms of teaching beside lake shores, where crowds gathered like families around beloved teacher whose words brought comfort to troubled hearts and hope to discouraged spirits, who had almost given up believing that divine love could reach into their circumstances and transform their understanding of what life could become when lived in relationship with their Creator, was drawing to its close as he gathered his disciples for pilgrimage that would transform everything they thought they understood about divine power and human salvation. His closest followers, men who had walked with him through countless villages where his presence had brought healing and restoration to lives broken by disease and sin and despair that had seemed permanent until divine love proved stronger than every force that opposes human flourishing, recognized that something fundamental had changed in their master's attitude and approach to ministry that had previously seemed like pleasant journey through countryside filled with opportunities to demonstrate God's goodness to people who needed evidence that they were loved and valued despite their failures and limitations. There was new intensity in his prayers that lasted longer and seemed to penetrate depths they could not fathom. Deeper urgency in his teaching that pressed against hearts with weight of eternity, concentrated into words that would have to sustain his followers through trials they could not yet imagine. Quality of purposeful determination that seemed to pull him toward Jerusalem despite obvious dangers that awaited him there like storm clouds gathering on horizon that everyone could see, but no one could prevent through human wisdom or earthly power. The disciples followed with growing uneasiness that mixed excitement about accompanying their master to Holy City during most important religious celebration of Jewish year with increasing anxiety about what such journey might cost them personally in terms of safety and security they had found in relatively peaceful ministry among villages of Galilee where people generally received them with openness and gratitude rather than suspicion and hostility they might encounter in Jerusalem where opposition was more organized and politically connected to authorities who possessed power to do more than argue or criticize. Some walked close behind Jesus, trying to catch fragments of his prayers as he communed with Heavenly Father about mission that was reaching its climactic moment when all accumulated sin and suffering of humanity would be concentrated into single experience of separation from divine love that would be more agonizing than any physical torture human cruelty could devise, more devastating than death itself because it would involve spiritual anguish that perfect holiness experiences when it comes into contact with moral corruption. Others hung back in group, whispering among themselves about wisdom of this journey that seemed like march toward certain disaster, wondering whether following Jesus to Jerusalem might be final mistake that would cost them everything they held dear, including their lives and futures and families, who depended on them for support and protection in a world where being associated with condemned criminal could bring persecution and suffering upon everyone connected to his movement, whether they had participated in whatever crimes might be charged. Word of Jesus' approach spread ahead of them like wildfire racing across dry grassland, reaching villages and towns along their route where people came out to see this teacher, whose reputation had traveled throughout Palestine and beyond its borders into regions where stories of his miraculous healings and revolutionary teachings had created expectations that varied dramatically depending on what hearers hoped to find in someone who claimed authority over life and death, sickness and health, sin and forgiveness that only divine power could legitimately exercise. Some came seeking healing for themselves or their loved ones, carrying sick children or elderly parents or disabled relatives who represented last hope for families that had exhausted every other resource in search of relief from conditions that had resisted all conventional treatments while consuming financial reserves and emotional strength that had once seemed adequate for normal challenges but proved insufficient when confronted with extraordinary needs requiring extraordinary intervention from sources beyond human capability. Others were simply curious about man who had become subject of so much discussion and debate among religious leaders who could not agree about his identity or significance, whose teachings seemed to contradict established interpretations of scriptural prophecy, while fulfilling expectations in ways that traditional messianic theories had not anticipated, whose methods of ministry challenged institutional authorities while demonstrating power that validated claims no mere human being should have been able to make without being immediately exposed as fraud. Many joined growing processions spontaneously, sensing that they were witnessing something historic that would be remembered and recounted for generations to come by those whose lives had been touched by encounter with divine love walking among mortals in mortal form, participating in events that would mark decisive turning point in human history when eternal purposes intersected with temporal circumstances to produce outcomes that would affect every soul that would ever draw breath upon earth that God had created and called good. Among those who joined their journey were people whose lives had been transformed by Jesus' ministry over previous years. Former outcasts who had been welcomed into his fellowship without regard for their past mistakes or present circumstances. Healed individuals whose restoration had become permanent. Testimony to divine power working through human weakness and vulnerability that made such power more rather than less impressive because it operated through ordinary people rather than requiring special conditions or exceptional qualifications. But there were also those who followed with darker intentions, agents sent by religious authorities to monitor Jesus' activities and report back on his movements and statements that might provide evidence for charges that could be brought against him in either religious or civil courts that possessed different types of jurisdiction, but shared common interest in maintaining stability that served existing power structures. Roman officials concerned about any gathering that might become politically disruptive during sensitive season when nationalist feelings ran high. As they approached Jerusalem, Jesus made arrangements to visit Bethany, small village where his close friends Mary, Martha, and Lazarus had welcomed him many times before into their home, that provided place of refuge and authentic fellowship, that offered respite from demands of public ministry, that never allowed complete privacy or total relaxation. From responsibilities that weighed heavily on his human heart, even as his divine nature remained perfectly at peace with Father's will unfolding exactly as it had been determined before foundation of world was laid. But this visit would involve more than rest and refreshment, becoming instead stage for most dramatic miracle of his entire earthly ministry, raising of Lazarus from dead after 4 days in tomb. Demonstration of power over death itself that would send shockwaves throughout region and provide final evidence of his divine nature that would either convince honest seekers or harden opposition of those whose hearts had already been closed to truth. No amount of evidence could penetrate because they had chosen darkness over light for reasons that had more to do with protecting their positions than seeking truth. When Jesus finally arrived in Bethany, he found household in mourning, with Martha and Mary grieving loss of their beloved brother and wondering why Jesus had not come sooner, when his presence could have prevented such tragedy that had plunged their family into sorrow and their community into sympathy for loss that seemed so unnecessary and premature, given his power to heal conditions that physicians could not cure and restore health that natural remedies could not provide through any combination of herbs or treatments known to medical practitioners. Their questions revealed kind of honest wrestling with divine purposes that characterizes authentic faith rather than superficial belief that accepts everything without question. Struggle to understand how divine love can coexist with human suffering in ways that challenge simple formulas about how God operates in a world where good people experience terrible losses and evil. People sometimes prosper despite their wickedness, where justice seems delayed and mercy appears selective, according to criteria that human understanding cannot decipher or predict. Chapter 12. The Last Supper and Betrayal. In an upper room that had been carefully prepared according to specific instructions that revealed Jesus' supernatural knowledge of events about to unfold, and his divine control over circumstances that seemed to be spiraling toward catastrophe, but were actually proceeding according to eternal plan that would accomplish salvation through means that appeared to guarantee destruction. As shadows lengthened over Jerusalem and golden light of oil lamps began to flicker against stone walls that would witness most intimate and heartbreaking scene in all of human history, Jesus gathered with his 12 chosen companions for what he knew with terrible certainty would be their final meal together before everything they had shared for 3 years would be shattered by betrayal and suffering and apparent defeat. The Passover celebration that spread before them on low table, around which they reclined according to custom for festive meals that commemorated freedom from bondage, carried accumulated weight of centuries of tradition, each ritual element connecting them to their ancestors' experience of divine deliverance from slavery in Egypt, through miraculous intervention that demonstrated God's power over oppressive forces and his willingness to rescue his people when their situation seemed hopeless. Each prayer and symbolic food reminding them of divine faithfulness to covenant promises that had sustained Jewish identity through generations of wandering and waiting. Tonight, these ancient symbols would be invested with entirely new meaning as Jesus transformed this memorial of past deliverance into foundation of future salvation that would extend beyond ethnic boundaries to embrace all humanity in scope of divine love that knew no limits based on race or culture or social status or moral performance that typically determined who was considered worthy of divine favor according to human standards that reflected pride more than grace, exclusion more than inclusion, judgment more than mercy that characterized heart of God toward his creation. As they shared intimate fellowship that had sustained them through 3 years of ministry together, traveling from village to village where Jesus' teaching and healing had transformed countless lives while gradually building opposition from religious authorities who felt threatened by his influence over populations they had previously controlled through careful maintenance of systems designed to regulate every aspect of spiritual life. There was atmosphere of both celebration and underlying tension that none of them could quite identify, despite growing sense that something momentous was approaching. Jesus seemed simultaneously peaceful and deeply moved, speaking with intensity that suggested these words carried eternal significance while displaying tenderness that revealed his infinite love for these imperfect men who had walked with him through miracles and controversies, triumphs that had lifted their spirits and disappointments that had tested their faith, moments of clarity when divine purposes seemed obvious, and periods of confusion when nothing made sense except their commitment to follow wherever he might lead them. Before they began formal meal with its prescribed rituals and familiar prayers that connected every Jewish family to shared history of divine deliverance and ongoing hope for ultimate restoration of all things, according to divine purposes that transcended individual understanding but could be trusted because they flowed from wisdom and love that never failed those who committed their lives to divine will, even when that will led through valleys they would prefer to avoid. Jesus rose from his place at table and did something so shocking that it reduced his disciples to stunned silence. He removed his outer garments with deliberate care that suggested profound significance in every action, wrapped towel around his waist like common servant preparing for menial labor that even household slaves often tried to avoid because it placed them in position of such humiliation. Poured water into basin that would normally be used by lowest members of household staff for washing feet of guests, whose sandaled journey through dusty streets had left them in need of cleansing before they could properly participate in sacred meal, and began to perform work that violated every social convention about dignity and respect. Peter's protest was immediate and vehement, his voice expressing shock and embarrassment that they all felt at witnessing such divine humility, such complete reversal of every normal understanding of authority and respect that governed relationships between teachers and students, masters and disciples, leaders and followers who were supposed to serve rather than be served by those whose superior wisdom and spiritual development entitled them to honor rather than requiring them to humble themselves before others whose qualifications could never match their own. When Jesus gently insisted that Peter could not understand significance of what was happening until later, when events would illuminate truths that were hidden in present darkness but would become clear in light of resurrection that would transform their understanding of everything they had witnessed during their years with him. Peter's response was characteristically absolute in its swing from one extreme to another without finding middle ground that might have been more appropriate for a situation that required neither complete rejection nor total acceptance, but thoughtful consideration. After Jesus finished washing their feet and returned to his place at table, he made lesson explicit while demonstrating through actions principles he had been teaching through words throughout his ministry that consistently emphasized service over domination, humility over pride, love over law that could become burden when divorced from grace that makes obedience expression of gratitude rather than attempt to earn favor from God, who gives his favor freely to anyone willing to receive it through faith that trusts in divine goodness rather than human worthiness. As they began sharing Passover meal with its traditional elements and familiar prayers, connecting them to their spiritual heritage and divine promises that had sustained their people through centuries of testing and persecution, Jesus took unleavened bread that commemorated their ancestors' hasty departure from Egyptian bondage and invested it with meaning that would echo through eternity as symbol of his body given for redemption of humanity enslaved to sin and death and separation from God, who had created them for fellowship with himself. "Take and eat," he said. breaking bread and distributing it among disciples who received these familiar elements with growing awareness that something unprecedented was happening. "This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." Simple act of sharing food became profound symbol of divine love, poured out completely for human salvation, transforming ordinary meal into sacred covenant that would bind believers to their Savior and to one another across centuries and cultures and circumstances that might otherwise divide them. Similarly, cup of wine that traditionally represented joy and divine blessing became symbol of new covenant, sealed not with blood of sacrificial animals whose death provided temporary covering for sin, but with Jesus' own life poured out for forgiveness of sins that separate human hearts from holy God, who desires relationship but cannot compromise his perfect righteousness by ignoring rebellion that must be dealt with according to divine justice, tempered by infinite mercy expressed through substitutionary sacrifice that satisfied both justice and love. "This cup is new covenant in my blood," he told them as they shared wine that would forever after remind his followers of price paid for their redemption, which is poured out for you and for many for forgiveness of sins. The disciples received these elements with reverence, though they could not yet grasp full significance of what Jesus was telling them about his approaching death and its meaning for their salvation, and for salvation of everyone who would ever believe in his name and trust in his finished work rather than their own efforts to earn divine acceptance. But then atmosphere in room shifted dramatically as Jesus made an announcement that sent shockwaves through their intimate fellowship, words that fell like stones into peaceful gathering and created ripples of confusion and distress that reached every heart around table, where love had been celebrated and covenant established through shared bread and wine that would sustain them through trials they could not yet imagine facing without his physical presence to guide and comfort them. "One of you will betray me," he declared with voice that carried both sorrow for what was coming and certainty about divine plan that would be accomplished despite human weakness and failure. And they began asking one by one whether surely he didn't mean them, their voices revealing genuine bewilderment at possibility that anyone among their number could be capable of such treachery against one who had loved them completely and sacrificially and patiently despite their imperfections and failures. And moments of doubt that had tested his commitment to them, Judas departed into darkness that seemed to symbolize spiritual condition of his heart, having made final choice between love and silver, between eternal treasure and temporary gain, between loyalty to one who had accepted him completely and service to those who would use his betrayal for their own purposes, before discarding him like broken tool that had served its function and was no longer needed for accomplishing their plans to eliminate threat to their authority. Chapter 13. The Cross and the Crown. From peaceful intimacy of upper room, where love had been demonstrated through service that reversed every human expectation about power and greatness, and covenant had been established through shared bread and wine that would forever after remind his followers of price paid for their redemption. Jesus led his disciples through sleeping streets of Jerusalem toward garden called Gethsemane, place of ancient olive trees where he had often retreated for prayer and communion with Heavenly Father, whose will he had come to accomplish regardless of personal cost that would test even divine nature to its absolute limits while providing ultimate demonstration of love's commitment to human salvation. The garden that had been sanctuary of peace during their previous visits, where solitude and natural beauty had provided perfect environment for contemplation and worship that refreshed his human spirit while strengthening his resolve to complete mission that had brought him from heavenly glory to earthly sorrow, felt different this night as they passed beneath branches heavy with leaves that rustled in evening breeze like whispered prayers ascending toward stars that had witnessed countless Human struggles, but none comparable to cosmic conflict about to unfold. Atmosphere was charged with sense of impending crisis that even disciples could sense, despite their incomplete understanding of what was approaching with each passing hour, that brought them closer to events that would transform their understanding of everything they thought they knew about divine power and human salvation, about earthly kingdoms and heavenly purposes, about victory that appears as defeat and strength, that expresses itself through weakness that confounds human wisdom, while revealing divine love in its purest form. Jesus' demeanor had changed from tender intimacy they had experienced during their final meal together to something heavier, more burdened by weight of divine mission as it reached climactic moment when all accumulated sin and suffering of humanity would be concentrated into single experience of separation from Father's love that would be more agonizing than any physical torture human cruelty could devise, more devastating than death itself because it would involve spiritual anguish that perfect holiness experiences when it comes into contact with moral corruption that defiles everything it touches. "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to point of death," he told Peter, James, and John, 3 disciples he had chosen to accompany him deeper into garden while others waited at entrance, where they could watch for approaching danger that he knew was coming but which they hoped might somehow be avoided through vigilance and prayer that had sustained them through previous difficulties and could perhaps sustain them through this final crisis if they remained faithful to their commitment. "Stay here and keep watch with me," he requested with voice that carried both authority of divine command and vulnerability of human need for companionship, during an hour when isolation would make agony even more unbearable, when loneliness would compound physical and spiritual torment into a combination of sufferings that no human being had ever endured or could endure except for one whose perfect innocence made him capable of bearing guilt he had never earned while maintaining love for those whose guilt he was assuming, moving beyond even these closest companions whose presence provided some comfort but could not share burden that was his alone to carry as substitute for humanity that deserved judgment but would receive mercy through his voluntary sacrifice. Jesus fell face down on ground that received his prostrate form like altar, prepared for offering that would surpass every sacrifice ever made in human history. His face pressed against earth that would soon drink his blood while his heart broke under pressure of divine wrath against sin. "My Father," he prayed with voice that carried agony no human throat had ever expressed, words torn from depths of divine nature wrestling with human nature in perfect unity, yet perfect tension, as 2 aspects of his being confronted reality of what perfect love was willing to endure for sake of imperfect creatures who deserved condemnation but would receive salvation through substitute who would experience their punishment, if it is possible. "May this cup be taken from me." The cup he referenced was not merely physical death that would end his earthly ministry in pain and humiliation, but spiritual agony of bearing humanity's sin in his own person, experiencing separation from divine love that sin creates, drinking full measure of divine wrath against human rebellion while maintaining perfect love for those whose rebellion he was taking upon himself voluntarily as their representative and substitute before divine justice that could not be satisfied by anything less than perfect payment. Yet even in this moment of ultimate testing when human nature recoiled from suffering that lay ahead and divine nature grieved over necessity that made such suffering unavoidable if love was to triumph over justice, without compromising either attribute of divine character, Jesus concluded his prayer with words that secured redemption of everyone who would ever believe in him as their Savior and Lord, their substitute and their source of righteousness before God, who accepts Christ's perfect sacrifice. "Not as I will, but as you will," he surrendered with submission that revealed perfect harmony between Father and Quivo, Son, even in moment when that harmony would be temporarily broken by sin-bearing, that would separate them in ways that had never occurred in eternity past, and would never occur again in eternity future, making this moment unique in divine experience, as love embraced suffering for sake of creatures who could never repay debt they owed. 3 times he prayed this prayer of ultimate surrender, and 3 times he returned to find his disciples sleeping despite his request that they keep watch with him during hour of greatest need, when human companionship might have provided some small comfort to ease isolation that made spiritual agony even more unbearable, their failure revealing human inability to comprehend or participate in depths of what divine love was willing to endure. As Jesus emerged from his final time of prayer, face radiant with peace that comes from complete surrender to divine will, despite costs such surrender would require, strengthened by angelic ministry that had been sent from heaven to prepare him for ordeal ahead while confirming Father's approval of Son's willingness to drink cup that had been prepared for him. Sound of approaching footsteps and flickering torches broke garden's sacred silence with harsh intrusion of human hatred into divine love's moment of supreme preparation. Judas arrived leading crowd of soldiers and temple guards, armed with swords and clubs, as if they were arresting dangerous criminal whose followers might attempt violent resistance, rather than teacher whose only weapons had been words of love and acts of compassion that had brought healing to thousands and hope to countless others who had discovered in his presence what divine love looked like when it walked among mortals in mortal form, whose only crime had been demonstrating divine mercy in ways that threatened earthly power structures built on exclusion rather than inclusion, judgment rather than grace that transforms hearts and heals relationships. The betrayal was accomplished through kiss, traditional greeting between rabbi and disciple perverted into signal for arrest, intimacy weaponized for treachery, trust transformed into most infamous act of betrayal in human history that would forever after serve as warning about what happens when hearts choose silver over loyalty, temporary gain over eternal treasure. Fear over faith that trusts divine promises, even when circumstances suggest reasons for doubt or despair, that tempt souls to abandon hope in divine goodness. Yet even in this moment of ultimate rejection by one of his chosen companions, Jesus called Judas friend and asked why he had come, extending grace to very one who was delivering him to his enemies, offering love even to heart that had chosen material reward over spiritual relationship, demonstrating mercy toward one whose betrayal would accomplish divine purposes, while destroying betrayer's soul through guilt that no amount of silver could ease or earthly pleasure could diminish or human comfort could heal because it had been earned through violation of sacred trust. When Peter drew sword in futile attempt to defend his master through violence that contradicted everything Jesus had taught about responding to evil with good, to hatred with love, to aggression with peaceful resistance that trusted divine power rather than human strength, Jesus immediately healed ear that Peter had severed from high priest's servant while rebuking this attempt at armed resistance that would have justified Roman retaliation against all his followers and missed entirely point of his mission that required him to submit to human injustice. The trials that followed were travesties of justice from beginning to end, conducted by religious leaders who had already decided on their verdict and were merely seeking legal justification for predetermined conclusion that would eliminate threat. Jesus posed to their authority over populations who were beginning to question whether traditional leadership truly represented divine will or merely human ambition disguised as spiritual devotion that served institutional interests more than divine purposes or human needs crying out for compassionate response. They brought forward false witnesses whose testimonies contradicted each other in ways that would have resulted in dismissal of charges under normal circumstances, where justice mattered more than expedience. asked trick questions designed to entrap Jesus into statements that could be construed as blasphemy or sedition, depending on which court offered best chance for conviction, ultimately condemning him for crime of claiming to be who he actually was, Son of living God, whose identity they could not accept because it challenged their understanding of how divine power should operate in human affairs. When morning came and Jesus was led before Pontius Pilate, Roman governor whose primary concern was maintaining order that served imperial interests rather than pursuing justice that served human dignity. The contrast between earthly power that ruled through force and fear and heavenly power that served through love and sacrifice became visible to anyone with eyes to see spiritual realities beneath political maneuvering that reduced eternal questions to matters of temporary convenience. Pilate's interrogation revealed his growing conviction that Jesus was innocent of charges being brought against him by religious authorities whose motives seemed more political than spiritual, more concerned with protecting their positions than serving divine truth. But his weakness in face of pressure from crowds demanding crucifixion showed how earthly authority ultimately serves itself, rather than justice or mercy, or any principle higher than self-preservation and political expediency that sacrifices individuals for supposed benefit of systems. The cross that Jesus carried through streets lined with people who had heard him teach and witnessed his miracles, but now either abandoned him in his hour of greatest need or actively participated in his humiliation and torture, represented not just instrument of execution, but symbol of divine love willing to bear any burden for sake of human redemption. Willing to endure any suffering if it would open pathway for reconciliation between holy God and sinful humanity that had been separated by rebellion, but could be reunited through sacrifice that satisfied both justice and mercy. As nails pierced hands that had blessed children and healed sick and broken bread for hungry multitudes, as crown of thorns was pressed into head that had never harbored evil thought or selfish ambition. As divine love hung suspended between earth and heaven, bearing weight of all human sin and guilt and shame that belonged to every person who would ever live, Jesus spoke words that revealed character of divine heart, even in moment of ultimate suffering and apparent defeat that would prove to be ultimate victory over every force that opposes human flourishing. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. He prayed for very ones who were torturing him, demonstrating that divine love extends even to those who reject it most completely. That mercy reaches even to hearts that have chosen hatred over love. That grace covers even sins committed against grace itself, because divine love operates according to principles that transcend human understanding and human justice and human capacity for forgiveness that has limits while divine forgiveness knows no boundaries. Chapter 14. The promise fulfilled in profound silence that followed Jesus' death. Silence broken only by weeping of women who had loved him and awed whispers of witnesses who recognized they had observed something unprecedented in human experience, something that challenged every assumption about power and weakness, victory and defeat. Life and death that governed human understanding of how divine purposes operate in world that often seems abandoned by any benevolent force. Very fabric of creation seemed to hold its breath as earth and heaven processed completion of most significant event in human history. Voluntary sacrifice of divine love for human redemption that would echo through eternity. The Roman centurion who had supervised countless executions during his military career, professional soldier accustomed to witnessing death in its most brutal forms, without allowing emotion to interfere with duty, that required him to maintain order among crowds that gathered to watch public punishment, designed to deter crime through display of consequences, found himself compelled to acknowledge what he had observed during these 3 hours when darkness covered earth and temple veil was torn and rocks split as if nature itself was responding to an event that transcended natural categories and demanded supernatural explanation. Surely this was righteous man, he declared with conviction that surprised him because it emerged from depths of his being where truth resided. Despite years of training designed to suppress such responses in favor of professional detachment, and according to some accounts, truly this man was Son of God. Even this hardened military officer, whose profession required emotional distance from suffering he was required to oversee, could not remain unmoved by manner of Jesus' death. Dignity he maintained throughout ordeal. Forgiveness he extended to executioners who were simply following orders without understanding significance of what they were doing to incarnate love. As evening approached and Sabbath drew near according to Jewish reckoning, that began new day at sunset rather than sunrise, creating urgency for proper burial procedures that had to be completed before Holy Day, commenced with its restrictions on work that included handling dead bodies. Joseph of Arimathea, wealthy member of ruling council who had been secret follower of Jesus throughout his ministry but had lacked courage to publicly identify himself with teacher whose popularity among common people was matched by hostility from religious authorities, finally found strength to act according to his convictions. This was a moment that required him to choose between safety that came from remaining hidden among those who opposed Jesus and integrity that demanded he honor in death the one he had followed in secret during life, between preserving his position and reputation among colleagues who had condemned Jesus as blasphemer, deserving death, and acknowledging publicly his belief that this condemnation had been unjust, between maintaining comfortable anonymity and accepting risks that came with open discipleship that might cost him everything he had worked lifetime to achieve. His request to Pilate for permission to bury Jesus' body properly, rather than allowing it to be thrown into common grave reserved for executed criminals whose families could not afford private burial or whose crimes had made them outcasts even in death, was act of considerable bravery that publicly identified him with condemned man and could have resulted in loss of his position on ruling council, damage to his reputation that might affect his business relationships, possibly even criminal charges if authorities decided his request indicated seditious sympathies. Together with Nicodemus, another member of religious establishment who had first come to Jesus under cover of darkness to avoid being seen by colleagues who would have questioned his interest in teacher, whose methods challenged their authority, and whose message threatened their comfortable assumptions, Joseph carefully removed Jesus' body from cross that had become altar where perfect sacrifice was offered for imperfect humanity, and wrapped it in linen cloths with expensive spices that cost them considerable sum, but represented investment in hope that death was not final word. The tomb where they laid Jesus' body was new one that Joseph had prepared for his own eventual use, carved from solid rock in garden near place of crucifixion, sealed with massive stone that would require several strong men to move under normal circumstances, guarded by Roman soldiers who had been posted there at request of religious authorities who remembered his predictions about rising from dead on third day and wanted to prevent disciples from stealing body and claiming resurrection had occurred when they knew such thing was impossible according to natural laws. The women who had followed Jesus from Galilee, watching from distance as he died while noting carefully where his body was laid so they could return after Sabbath to complete burial preparations that had been performed hastily due to time constraints, planned to honor him with final act of devotion that their love made necessary, even though their hearts were breaking with grief that seemed unbearable and their faith was shattered by apparent failure of everything they had believed and hoped. But while they mourned what appeared to be ultimate victory of hatred over love, death over life, despair over hope that had seemed so bright and beautiful during days when Jesus had walked among them, bringing healing to sick and comfort to mourning. Good news to poor who had been forgotten by everyone else. Something unprecedented was stirring in tomb where his body had been laid. Something that would transform their grief into joy, their despair into hope, their confusion into clarity about divine love's ultimate victory. Early on first day of week, before dawn had fully broken over Jerusalem still sleeping in aftermath of Passover, celebration that had been overshadowed by execution that had shocked even those who had demanded it, Mary Magdalene made her way to tomb carrying spices to anoint Jesus' body, her heart heavy with sorrow but her devotion compelling her to perform final act of service for one who had transformed her life by freeing her from demons that had tormented her and giving her purpose and identity and hope she had never imagined possible. When she arrived at Garden Tomb, she discovered something that challenged every assumption about permanence of death and finality of separation that death creates between those who remain and those who depart. Something that would transform understanding of what divine love could accomplish when it was willing to pay ultimate price for human redemption. That seemed impossible according to human calculations, but proved possible through divine power that specializes in accomplishing what human wisdom declares cannot be done. The massive stone that had sealed entrance was rolled away, not from outside as if someone had broken in to steal body, but from inside as if someone had broken out, lying at angle that suggested it had been moved not by human strength, but by supernatural force that made its weight irrelevant. Its security meaningless before power that recognizes no barriers, when love determines to demonstrate its victory over death itself, and every force that opposes human flourishing and divine purposes for creation. Angels whose very presence transformed tomb from place of death into sanctuary of divine glory greeted her bewilderment with words that will echo through eternity, bringing hope to every heart that has ever been broken by loss and every soul that has ever wondered whether love is strong enough to overcome forces that seem invincible to human understanding and experience, whether promises about eternal life are more than comfort offered to grieving hearts, but have no basis in reality that transcends wishful thinking. "Why do you look for living among dead?" they asked with voices that carried music of heaven into earthly sorrow, that had grown accustomed to finality and separation and endings that seemed permanent until love proved stronger than death and hope more enduring than any earthly circumstance that might challenge faith in divine goodness and care for those who trust in promises that seem too wonderful to be true but proved too wonderful not to be true when divine love determined to demonstrate its power. "He is not here. He has risen, just as he said," they announced with authority that came from witnessing resurrection, that validated every claim Jesus had made about his identity and mission and relationship with Father who had sent him to seek and save lost sheep who had wandered far from love but could find their way home through Shepherd who had laid down his life for them and taken it up again to prove that love is stronger than death and life, more powerful than any force that opposes divine purposes for human flourishing. Their invitation to come and see place where he lay became invitation to witness evidence that death had been conquered. Grave had been robbed of its victory. Hope was not only restored, but vindicated in most wonderful way imaginable by love that proved itself through ultimate test, that demonstrated its commitment to human welfare by paying ultimate price, and then proving that payment was sufficient to purchase freedom from every bondage that enslaves human hearts and separates them from joy they were created to experience. Chapter 15. Until we meet again in peace, here at gentle conclusion of our sacred journey together through life and love of Jesus Christ. As peaceful darkness of night settles around you like most comforting embrace, that speaks of divine care for every detail of your existence, and your breathing naturally deepens into rhythm of blessed rest that comes from knowing You are held by arms that will never grow weary of carrying you through every trial and every joy that awaits you. I want to pause with you in profound gratitude for these precious hours we have shared, walking together through most beautiful and transformative story ever told, experiencing together love that has changed countless hearts across centuries and continues changing hearts tonight. We began this evening with you carrying whatever burdens today had placed upon your shoulders, perhaps feeling overwhelmed by responsibilities that seemed to multiply faster than your strength to meet them, possibly questioning your worth or wondering if there truly existed love in this universe that knew your name and cared about your deepest needs and longest struggles that sometimes feel too heavy for human heart to bear without breaking under weight of disappointment and discouragement that accumulates like dust on traveler's cloak, making each step more difficult and each breath more labored. We conclude with you, resting securely in embrace of that very love we have encountered together, surrounded by truth that you have never been alone and never could be alone, because you are cherished beyond your ability to comprehend by one who spoke galaxies into existence, yet pays attention to every whispered prayer and silent longing of your heart that may feel insignificant when compared to cosmic forces and global events, but matters infinitely to divine love that measures significance not by size, but by depth of care, invested in every moment of attention given to creatures made in divine image. The Jesus we have met together in these quiet hours is not merely figure from ancient history, confined to pages of old books or memories of civilizations that have crumbled into dust, but living presence who reaches across every barrier of time and space to touch tired hearts exactly like yours, to offer rest to weary souls exactly like yours, to extend forgiveness and acceptance to imperfect people exactly like you and me, who need grace more than we need anything else this world could offer, who hunger for love more than we hunger for success or security or recognition. His love transcends historical boundaries and cultural limitations to meet you in your present circumstances with same tenderness that characterized his interactions with disciples who disappointed him and crowds who misunderstood him and enemies who betrayed him, yet never exhausted his capacity for forgiveness or diminished his commitment to their welfare despite their treatment of him during years when he walked among them, demonstrating what divine love looks like when it takes human form and chooses to serve rather than be served. The cross we witnessed together was not simply tragic end to beautiful life cut short by human jealousy and religious pride that could not tolerate challenge to established authority and institutional power, but ultimate demonstration of divine love willing to pay any price for human redemption. Definitive proof that there is no depth of human need that divine grace cannot reach, no darkness so profound that divine light cannot penetrate it, no heart so broken that divine love cannot heal it completely and restore it to fullness of life and joy. The resurrection we celebrated together revealed that this love is not merely beautiful sentiment that comforts grieving hearts, but has no power to change actual circumstances, not wishful thinking that helps people cope with harsh realities, but offers no genuine hope for transformation, but victorious power that conquers every enemy of human happiness and divine purpose. Eternal reality that proves stronger than death and more enduring than time itself, permanent transformation available to anyone willing to receive what they cannot achieve. If this sacred journey has brought even moment of genuine peace to your troubled heart that has been carrying anxiety and worry like stones in pocket that grow heavier with each passing day, if these ancient stories have awakened something beautiful in your spirit that had been sleeping under weight of disappointment and discouragement, if you have found yourself breathing more freely or feeling more connected to love that holds universe together, then you have discovered treasure worth guarding against every force that would steal or destroy. This community of fellow seekers that has formed around these contemplative stories represents something precious and rare in our modern world that often seems designed to fragment attention and fracture peace that souls desperately need for spiritual health. By joining our family through continued participation in this sacred conversation, by sharing your own reflections and experiences, you become part of something that transcends mere content consumption to become fellowship with people who understand that slowing down reveals more truth than speeding up. Your voice matters tremendously in sacred conversation we maintain together across continents and cultures. Your reflections and experiences adding unique threads to tapestry of testimony that encourages every heart encountering it to believe in possibilities for transformation and healing that divine love makes available to anyone whose heart remains open to receive such grace that costs nothing but pride and returns everything that makes life worth living with joy that transcends circumstances. Please share with us what this journey has meant to you. What particular moments have spoken most directly to your own need for hope or healing, or simply assurance that you matter to someone whose love never fails? Your questions reveal seeking heart, and seeking hearts are exactly what divine love delights to find and satisfy with truth that brings both comfort and challenge, both rest and renewal, that empowers service to others who need what you have received. In weeks and months ahead, we will continue exploring stories that possess power to heal wounded hearts and restore hope to discouraged spirits, journeying together through experiences of saints and mystics who discovered divine presence in desert silences and mountain solitudes, learning how their encounters with divine love can illuminate our own spiritual paths and provide practical wisdom for contemporary challenges that sometimes seem overwhelming but are never beyond reach of grace. Feel now how your body has naturally released every remaining tension that was holding muscles tight and nerves on edge. How your breathing has slowed to gentle rhythm of someone who knows they are completely safe in presence of love, that never sleeps or slumbers but watches over you with care, that notices every detail of your existence and responds to every need before you are even aware that need exists. How your heart has found its natural pace of rest. As sleep begins claiming your consciousness, carrying you from wakefulness into blessed unconsciousness, where divine love continues its healing work in regions of your soul too deep for conscious awareness to reach, but not too deep for divine grace to penetrate, with restoration that happens during rest when defenses are lowered and hearts are open to receive gifts they might refuse during waking hours. Let your final conscious thoughts be filled with gratitude for love you have encountered tonight. You are falling asleep not merely into natural rest that restores physical energy, but into everlasting arms that have held every believer who has ever found peace in divine love, every heart that has ever been healed by divine grace, every soul that has ever discovered their true identity as beloved child of God, who created them for relationship with Himself and destines them for eternal joy in His presence, where every tear will be wiped away and every sorrow transformed into happiness that lasts forever. Sweet dreams, precious child of divine love, knowing you are beloved beyond your ability to understand, accepted beyond your ability to earn, held by love stronger than death and more enduring than time itself, that will never let you go. Regardless of what storms may come, or what challenges may test your faith, or what changes may occur in external circumstances that cannot touch eternal relationship you have with one who knew you before you were born and will love you long after earthly journey has ended. Until we meet again in this sacred space where weary hearts find rest and searching souls discover home they have always been seeking, may you know beyond any doubt that you are treasured, you are valued, you are exactly who divine love created you to be. And you are destined for more beauty and joy and purpose than your heart can currently Imagine but will experience fully when perfect love casts out all fear and perfect peace surpasses all understanding. Rest now in perfect peace, surrounded by perfect love, held by perfect grace that covers every imperfection and transforms every weakness into strength, every failure into learning, every ending into new beginning, filled with possibilities as infinite as love that created you and will never stop believing in wonderful person. You are becoming through divine transformation, working patiently until that day when faith becomes sight and hope becomes reality and love becomes everything you have always known it was meant to be. Good night, dear one, and may divine love fill your dreams with visions of glory that awaits you. May angels watch over your sleep with protection that never fails. And may you awaken tomorrow refreshed not only in body, but renewed in spirit, ready for another day of walking in love that makes every ordinary moment sacred and every simple act of kindness, participation in divine purposes that extend far beyond what eyes can see or minds can comprehend, but hearts can know through faith that trusts. Completely in love that never fails. Amen and amen, beloved friend.